In the past, one of my biggest hindrances to trusting the Bible or taking a lot of what it said seriously was the violence in the Old Testament.
Interesting. Do you have any examples?
Why do some of the punishments in the Old Testament seem extreme? Like stoning someone for breaking the Sabbath or the ground swallowing people up alive. How could Elisha, one of the prophets, be so offended by these group of boys that he sent bears to maul them? Why does God seem to tolerate or even approve of things like slavery and polygamy? There's some very strange things that happen in the Old Testament, and it's very fair to wonder what's up with this. I mean, I'm saying this as a Christian who believes the Bible is the word of God.
More than fair. That's quite a list.
For as long as I've looked into answers about trying to understand certain things in the Old Testament, I'll be honest with you, I still have questions.
Me too, Melissa. Me too. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today we're going to be hearing from Paul Copan, the author of Did God Really Command Genocide? Is God a Vindictive Bully? And Is God a Moral Monster? Now, it strikes me that if your supporters have to publish a whole series of books explaining why you appear to be a genocidal bullying monster, but really aren't, that's probably not a great sign. Melissa Dougherty, known for being an ex-New Age Christian, which is about as nebulous as it sounds, recently interviewed Copan, the go-to philosopher to ease your mind when God seems like he may not be acting like an all-loving creator.
You're well known in our circles. We all know your books. We all recommend them.
Now, I'm not a Hebrew Bible specialist myself, but I happen to know a few from Paul Copan's Rogues Gallery, Dr. Kipp Davis and Dr. Joshua Bowen.
Who is this Paul Copan fellow?
Never heard of him. I made videos about Paul Copan before, and it always comes back to this. He clearly does not understand the biblical text on a scholarly level, which is a real problem when it comes to attempting to then grapple with the ethical questions of what's in the text. Philosophers, get the hell off my lawn. I'm serious. I'm just tired of having to make this point over and over and over again, whether it's Paul Copan.
I say this every time I talk about, I like Paul, right? Like he and I have interacted. I think he's a nice guy. But like, if everybody's misunderstanding you, problem's not with us. Oh, that Paul Copan.
Before we get to Paul's defense of the Old Testament, I want to mention that the audiobook for Kipp's most recent book, God's Propaganda, is finally available. Lots of books claim to be able to reshape the way you think about a familiar topic, but this one actually delivers. And for those of us with short attention spans, there's frequent mentions of zombies, dragons, and Simpsons to keep it fun. The audiobook is just under 24 hours long, making it just slightly shorter than one of his live streams.
Look who's talking.
And coming up very soon is the inaugural New Insights into the Hebrew Bible virtual conference, where Josh is a special guest presenter, amid speakers like Dr. Dan McClellan.
Never heard of him.
Sounds like someone who goes to work in a t-shirt.
Legendary thinkers like John Collins, Joel Baden, and friend of the channel Megan Lewis.
Oh, hey, I've heard of her.
Exploring how Genesis echoes ancient Mesopotamian creation myths.
How does it feel, Josh, to have second billing to your wife?
Like the world is finally righting itself.
And many more for 3 full days of world-class scholars, presenting cutting-edge research on the book of Genesis, designed for curious non-scholars, hosted by Bart Ehrman. Go to tinyurl.com/NIHB 2026, or click the link in the description to check out the schedule and the lineup. And by using that link, you're helping out this channel, so thank you.
All right, Paul, time to get back to the other Paul.
Now, at the end of our review, we're going to distill 3 rather precise questions that we would encourage Paul to respond to, given the arguments that he either makes or alludes to in this video.
So stick around to the end, or just skip there now.
That's bad YouTubing. You should definitely watch all the minutes of the video.
In the past, one of my biggest hindrances to trusting the Bible or taking a lot of what it said seriously was the violence in the Old Testament. What's up with slavery? Why did God allow certain things to happen?
Note the presumption on the part of Melissa here. Why did God allow things to happen? I mean, certainly God could not have commanded such things. He just permitted them for morally justified reasons. This presumption colors the entire discussion and will limit the types of conclusions and or explanations that Melissa and Paul can give.
I mean, why were people stoned for messing up the Sabbath? How could Elisha, one of the prophets, be so offended by these group of boys that he sent bears to maul them?
Some might call them covenant bears.
These are covenant bears.
In today's game, the Covenant Bears take on the churlish children in a matchup that is sure to end in a slaughter.
I see what you did there.
There's some very strange things that happen in the Old Testament, and it's very fair to wonder what's up with this. I mean, I'm saying this as a Christian who believes the Bible is the word of God. Here's the thing. I am not the only person in the history of Christianity who has asked these questions. These questions have been asked for hundreds of years by well-meaning Christians who also believe the Bible is the word of God. If there are answers out there, we look for them. It seems like every generation tends to ask the same problematic questions. Violence in the Old Testament. It also talks about slavery and polygamy and what's going on here. And so we answer the same questions every generation.
But if people have been asking the same questions one generation after another, even after well-meaning Christians for hundreds of years have been looking for answer, isn't that a problem in itself? Doesn't that just on its own suggest that the answers are either not actually out there or just not convincing?
And one person that I have found that is, at least in this generation, who is answering those questions is my friend, Paul Copan. He's written multiple books on this topic, taking questions like this and more head on. He doesn't skirt around it. He really attempts to try to answer these questions.
Right. This is very much what I was saying. We know Paul. We have dealt a lot with his apologetics for slavery, violence, and atrocities in the Old Testament. He's been doing this for over 20 years, has published several books on these topics, and speaks on them regularly. And yet, you're still asking the same questions he has tried ineffectively to answer. After having just straight up ignored devastating challenges from both of us and all sorts of other critics, Paul just plows forward. The same problems with the Bible remain glaring. Nothing is adequately dealt with nor resolved. This is a failure. No, this means the video is over. We can go home now? Wait, why are we still cartoons, Josh? And why does your cartoon have a beard?
I don't know what you're talking about.
What is happening?
I'll be honest with you, I still have questions. I still have a lot of questions about Genesis, for example, particularly the first 3 chapters. But I think that's the beauty of the Christian worldview, is that we don't have to have all the answers or understand everything in order for it to be true.
That's true of literally any topic. Biological evolution, quantum physics, computer science, ancient Sumerian. But when physicists thought that light being both a wave and a particle was contradictory, they didn't just say, it's a mystery. They developed quantum mechanics to explain it.
We go from the known to the unknown. You understand these fundamental core beliefs about Christianity, like the resurrection, for example, and you know why that's true, and then you work back from there.
May I suggest that perhaps Melissa explore the Paulogia versus Resurrection playlist and learn why perhaps it may not be true?
And this is the crux of the matter. You begin with your conclusion that this must be the word of God, and then you back into the data.
Oh, that's why. That's why we're still cartoons. Oh.
Paul, thank you so much for coming on my channel today to talk about this very contentious topic.
I guess the things that I'm asked to speak on most often are related to Old Testament ethical questions. And so my first book that came out on this is God, a Moral Monster. They all deal with differing topics. So is God, a Moral Monster?
So I get that Paul is interested in this stuff from an ethical perspective. He's a philosopher of religion by training, so of course that makes sense. But my problem with his work is always the same. He's addressing all of these topics from within his own very tightly predetermined evangelical Christian worldview, which takes for granted an incredibly naive perspective of the biblical texts that is simply not in conversation with relevant scholarship, not with biblical studies, archaeology, anthropology, or history. Paul will often attempt to bridge that gap by positing his own review of the primary and secondary literature, but as someone without adequate training in any of these fields, he just lacks the skills and the knowledge to be able to even know how to judge the quality and accuracy of the material, or even if he's reading it correctly. We're sure to see some of that on full display today.
And I struggled with this. I would stay away from the Old Testament because I'm like, nah, they got that wrong. I consider some of these to be the most common questions that people would ask about violence in the Old Testament. And the first one I'm going to ask you has to do with justifying the wars that God commanded. Did Israel sometimes just claim God was on their side to justify their wars? If God is all powerful and can bring justice himself, why did he choose to send Israel's armies, human beings, into battle, wiping out entire nations instead of executing judgment directly himself?
Well, just a brief answer to the latter part of your question. God can act directly or indirectly. We read about, of course, about the flood, which I talk about in my book, is God a Vindictive Bully, where God directly acts. And basically what we see God doing there is a last resort action where God is simply finishing what human beings have begun. The catastrophe that human beings have created for themselves, God just finishes and starts over, which is a picture of mercy and God's not giving up on human beings. But when it comes to the question of the first part of your question of isn't God isn't he kind of favoring Israel to do these sorts of things that he's selecting them, and this one looks like favoritism, like Israel can do no wrong and so forth.
Did you catch that? This is not an answer to the first question that Melissa asked. Did Israel sometimes just claim that God was on their side to justify their wars? She's not asking about God's part in whatever actions were taken by the Israelites. She's asking about their view of God as it informs their actions. In other words, are they just claiming God's commandment or sanction as an excuse for their extremely reprehensible behavior? Paul rather seems to want to respond to a question about whether God takes a different view of Israel's actions when compared to others. I actually think that Melissa's question is extremely important. Several weeks ago, I did a live stream in response to this video with Vishanti, and I intentionally focused on this because this is precisely what the author of the book of Joshua is doing. It's propaganda for legitimating an ideology and its outcomes. To be clear, critical scholars are usually extremely hesitant to find much of any value in the conquest stories as historical descriptions. They are fictions that are set in memories of the tumultuous events of the 13th and 12th centuries BCE in what is most often called the Bronze Age collapse. Some of these probably describe later impressions of actual destructions of Canaanite cities, like Jericho, Ai, Chatzor, and Lachish. But it's pretty much where the history in these texts ends, and we are left with their function and value as literature for the people who wrote them. For example, Tracy Lemosh, professor of Women and Gender Studies and Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto, has persuasively argued that the narratives of conquest in the book of Joshua were developed in Judea in the 7th century BCE and fostered a campaign of displacement and resource capture by wealthy landholders and aristocrats in a climate of expansion north, following the destruction of Samaria by the Assyrians. In his commentary on the book of Joshua, Thomas Dozeman has argued for an even later composition of Joshua at some point in the Persian or Hellenistic period, prior to the destruction by John Hyrcanus of the Samaritan temple at Mount Gerizim in the mid-2nd century BCE. See, for Dozeman, the book is an epic founding myth stemming from the Samaritan community for the entire people of Israel, but as a polemical response to the fiercely insular and ethnocentric Jewish propaganda of Ezra and Nehemiah. See, the point is that the stories of Joshua are late fictions, which functioned rhetorically for their readers in the promotion of their own ideologies. Like Melissa says, these stories make claims about God being on their side in order to justify policies among the ruling class. Not necessarily actual wars, but other forms of marginalization which threaten ethnic and cultural identities.
when in actual fact, God says, one, in Genesis 15:16, he tells Abraham that he's going to wait until the sin of the Amorites is completed or filled up. And what sorts of things were the Canaanites involved in? Well, incest, bestiality, ritual prostitution, infant sacrifice, things that would be considered criminal in any modern society.
We don't need to say a lot here, except to point out that a very well-worn tactic of propagandists is to denigrate and demonize one's opponents. We have plenty of evidence from early Iron Age material culture in Palestine that we would call Canaanite, and the findings show that these caricatures are just blatant exaggerations or completely false. This becomes especially complicated by the fact that the early Israelites were virtually indistinguishable from the rest of the Canaanites. The biblical descriptions of their adversaries are to be approached with suspicion. In the same way, we don't just accept as accurate the sensationalized products of any propaganda.
I mean, it might be useful to give an example of what we would all likely consider to be ancient Near Eastern propaganda, so that we can all see how problematic it is to take the word of an ancient text for the behavior or moral guilt of another people group. There's a 9th century Neo-Assyrian text that glorifies the violent campaigns of Shalmaneser III. It uses allegorical language in which he is referred to as the hunter, while his enemies are asses that he slaughters. The king and his army, quote, slashed the wombs of the pregnant, ripped out babies. Of their strongest, he cut the necks. The smoke of their land shut off their troops, end quote. Yikes. But wait, the text tells us why Shalmaneser did this. Quote, the one who sins against Asher, that's Shalmaneser's god, turns into ruin. Let me sing the victory of Asher mighty, who keeps going to battle and keeps achieving victory over worldwide coalitions. Let the first one hear and tell the later ones, end quote. I mean, look, these people obviously deserved it because the text tells us that they sinned against the god Asher. Whew. I thought for a second that these were like heinous atrocities. Good thing the text sets us straight.
But God is going to be patient and wait over half a millennium until this actually takes place. So there isn't this precipitous action that God is engaging in. God is going to wait until the time is right. And it would have been wrong for the Israelites to go in earlier against the Canaanites. In fact, this involves the Israelites going into slavery for 430 years in Egypt. So these are the sorts of things that we need to see as part of the backdrop to this. God also told the Israelites that they are to drive out the Canaanites. That's the major command, drive out. If you're driving them out, you have destroyed them. But we'll come back to that shortly.
And I am sure that when Paul does come back to this point, we shall all be very happily persuaded by his ironclad reasoning. But in the meantime, I'm curious about how he is quantifying this as the major command.
The question of driving out the Canaanites was something that God said, used the language of the land is going to vomit out the Canaanites, and he says, and the land is going to vomit you out too if you imitate the practices of the Canaanites. In fact, we do see that is actually takes place with the northern kingdom of Israel, that the Assyrians come in as a result of God's judgment in 722 BC, and then the southern kingdom goes into exile in 586, 587 BC to Babylon. Of course, they end up returning. Many of them do back to resettle the land. But these are acts of judgment that God is actually saying, you've been acting in Canaanite-like ways, and this is the judgment that comes upon you. Now, when it comes, another part of the question seemed to suggest that the Israelites were going into the land of Canaan, descending upon these hapless peoples, and the question often comes up, how would you like it if another nation invaded yours? Well, keep in mind, the Israelites were fighting against people who were far superior to them numerically, militarily, and in terms of the strength of their cities. That these were solid cities, and the Israelites, it was a daunting undertaking for them. And so that's why the Lord tells Joshua, don't fear, be dismayed, I'm with you, because this was a daunting prospect. And so it required belief in God. It required trusting in God because the Israelites were not militarily equipped. They were outnumbered. And so this is something that is often overlooked in that whole discussion. If anybody was to be afraid, it was the Israelites rather than the Canaanites.
Let me see if I'm following Paul's line of reasoning here. One, God said to drive them out rather than exterminate them. But he'll come back to that later, and so shall we. Two, the Israelites suffered the same fate as the Canaanites. And three, the Canaanites outnumbered them and were militarily superior. So the Israelites should have been afraid, not the Canaanites. Did I get that right? Let's grant all of it for the sake of argument. They were to drive out the people rather than exterminate them. They were punished in the same way later. The Canaanites outmatched them in size and skill. So the fuck what? If they primarily drove them out, does that make it okay? I mean, would it be meaningfully less egregious if the indigenous population were violently evicted from their homeland? Does Paul think that Israel approached the Canaanites and said, gee, golly, would y'all mind skedaddling off this here land? To which the indigenous population replied, well, shucks, sounds good to me. Never did like this place anyway. I just don't understand the significance of this point. Second, so what if God did the same thing to his own people? That just makes God an immoral monster to the Canaanites and to the Israelites. Sick flex? I mean, and it doesn't matter what should have been the case. The text is explicit in many places that the inhabitants of the land were terrified of the Israelites. And how would that help Paul in this discussion? If the JV basketball team were playing a game against four shorter, unskilled people and Michael Jordan, would it really matter that the four were not terribly good at basketball? Michael Jordan would be the overwhelming force on the court working on their behalf. So, according to Paul's argument, would it really matter if the Israelites, scared and outnumbered, showed up with Yahweh on their team? None of this makes any sense to me, except as a series of red herrings intended to get the audience to temper their reaction to the actual data when it is presented. It would be like saying, now, before we talk about slavery in the American South in the 19th century, let me remind you that slaves were generally given Sundays off. So the fuck what?
And keep in mind, too, the Israelites had just come from Egypt, and now they're going into a place dominated, these Canaanite cities, these sometimes royal cities, were they were colonized by the Egyptians themselves. So they're going from those who had engaged in traumatizing them, oppressing them, and so forth, to something that looked very similar, these colonized cities. And keep in mind, too, these were more like military citadels and administrative centers, from what we can see archaeologically and historically, that these cities were not where you had major civilian populations. You might have an occasional Rahab-type figure, but those were more in the outlying areas, the civilians were. And it was basically those who are the military and administrative personnel who were inhabiting these cities. And somebody like Rick Hess at Denver Seminary has laid some of these things out. I'm not going to go into detail here, but that's, I think, a very interesting and important thing to keep in mind.
It is always so interesting to me to see how apologists will adjust their narrative to try to fit new data into their paradigm. Notice how he states that some of these cities were, quote, colonized by the Egyptians themselves. This is completely absent from the biblical narrative and in direct contradiction to some of it. But it's intended to address what archaeologists have determined about the southern Levant during the end of the late Bronze Age, that Egypt was in control of the region. He also cites Hess's article about Jericho and Ai, which Kipp and I have dealt with elsewhere. Suffice it to say, Hess's methodology and conclusions leave something to be desired. The fact is, if we are going by the narrative, these were not citadel cities or simply military outposts, only rarely inhabited by non-military or administrative personnel. Rahab and all her family, by the way, are not outliers. Instead, we see that the narrative has general population groups living inside of these cities, especially Jericho and Ai. So no, I don't think this is a, quote, very interesting and important thing to keep in mind, Paul.
Maybe it's just me, but I don't think it's really the best look that Rahab and her family are the only civilians mentioned in the Conquest stories to survive the invasions of the Israelites. Okay, so hear me out. After Jericho and Ai, Joshua leads the Israelites to attack and destroy the cities of Gibeon, Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, and Devir. They traveled from the south and destroyed the cities of Hatzor, Madon, Shimron, and Achshaph. In all of these places, we are told that the Israelites killed everyone. No one was left that breathed. That's what the text says. Paul seems to have missed that even if A handful of these places had a Rahab type figure. None of them were spared. They were all slaughtered. But let's entertain this point about administrative citadels for a moment. Broadly speaking, what Paul says is essentially accurate.
To be clear, Kipp, it's accurate from an archaeological perspective, but not the perspective of the narrative.
Yes, right. No question. True. Yes, most of the cities in late Bronze Age Canaan were quite small, and many of these were military installations. Gaza, Bet Shean, and Jaffa were Egyptian cities from which they controlled the entire southern region. So according to Christian Frevel, the city complexes were not large. On average, they had a settlement area of about 5 hectares. This corresponds to a square area whose sides are about 225 meters. As a rule, no more than 2,000 people lived in the cities. But importantly, this is an average. Paul wants his viewers to think that the small size of a lot of the Canaanite cities and the fact that a few of them were military outposts is true of all of them. And it just isn't. The largest city in southern Canaan was Lachish, and it had a population of probably 6,000 people. We are told in Joshua 10:32 that Israel killed everyone in the city with the sword. That would be all 6,000 people. The largest city in the entire region was Hatzor, covering an area of over 80 hectares and was home to probably as many as 12,000 people. In Joshua 11:11, it says that the Israelites killed every person that was in Hatzor with the sword and made it a herem offering. There was nothing left that breathed, and they burned Hatzor with fire. Incidentally, a herem offering was a sacred vowed sacrifice through which everything was devoted to gods and destroyed. That would be 12,000 people. Everyone killed, nothing left alive. Paul is conveniently rehearsing a basic truth about Canaan, that most cities were small and some were administrative centers. And then he's applying that to the account of every settlement in the conquest stories. But he's misleading his audience by failing to acknowledge that there were actually major civilian populations very obviously in view for the writers of these stories.
So a minute ago, the justification for wiping out these populations was their moral depravity. Now we're being told that the descending populations didn't even live there? Those are two different arguments. Pick one.
Also, the ancient Near East language engaged in a lot of trash talk when it came to military battles. We totally annihilated those guys. We wiped them out, man, woman, young and old. And what you have going on is the Israelites using that same sort of hyperbolic language, that sort of trash talk, like we use with our sports teams and so forth.
Yes, and unlike when we use trash talk and hyperbole in sports, when people in antiquity exaggerated the size of their military victories, they were still speaking of large numbers of actual people whom they actually killed. It feels like this is not quite the same thing that Paul is talking about.
But when you read these texts, you see that there is a lot of hyperbole that is used. So, like, for example, one battle where the Israelites are fighting against these two Amorite kings in Numbers 21, Sihon and Og. Well, you have, it's first of all, they drive out the people from the villages in Numbers 21, and then they fight. It says they fought against the king, his sons, and his army. So it's clearly combatant versus combatant, fighting. But Deuteronomy, which utilizes that sort of hyperbolic rhetorical language, says, man, woman, young and old. But when you look at the actual battle scene, it was actually between combatant armies. So Deuteronomy hypes up that language, and Deuteronomy is very, much known for that sort of rhetorical, trash talk. But actually, when you look at the battle itself, it wasn't at all, that kind of a construction. It wasn't man, woman, young and old, the totality of civilians. It was actually just between combatants.
Paul is going to return to this below, so I'll limit my comments here to a particular point. Let's assume that Paul is correct, and this language is indeed hyperbolic. If there is a term that I hear thrown around without any thought for what it might mean in the context, it is hyperbole. Let's take one of the examples that is cited in academic discussions of war rhetoric in the ancient Near East by people like Lawson Younger, who wrote his dissertation on the topic. In the Chicago Taylor Prism, the Neo-Assyrian king Sennacherib has an inscription that reads, Quote, I put to the sword the population of the city Herem, a dangerous enemy, and I did not spare a single one. I hung their corpses on poles and placed them around the city. I reorganized that district and imposed for eternity 1 ox, 10 sheep, 10 omers of wine, and 20 omers of dates, and his first fruits offerings to the gods of Assyria, my lords. Here, I'm going to quote from an article that I wrote in the edited volume, Misusing Scripture. What are evangelicals doing with the Bible? Here's the quote. There is little doubt this language of complete annihilation, I did not spare a single one, cannot be understood to reflect reality on the ground. The Assyrian king did not actually kill every individual in the city. But does this make Sennacherib's campaign more ethically palatable? I doubt any evangelical would come to the defense of Sennacherib and the violence he portrayed and executed upon his enemies. Even if someone were to point out in these inscriptions that the king is described as being perfect, just, called to defend the poor and weak, that this would have any effect on changing their perspective. When the Assyrian enemies are identified as rebellious and guilty, evangelicals would consider these descriptions in their context. It is unsurprising that the new Assyrian king would present the enemy as deserving or even requiring of judgment and violence. These things would be seen as clear cases of propaganda, requiring additional evidence to substantiate the claims of the, quote, wickedness or guilt of those subjected to that violence. Why do evangelicals often not subject the Bible to this same standard, end quote. Now, we can hardly assume that the hyperbole in Sennacherib's inscription indicates that no force, no violence was used against the city. Nor can we wink at the violence inflicted because the inscription tells us that Sennacherib is the good guy and the inhabitants of the city are the bad guys. I think John Collins said it best.
Is it just hyperbole? I think not. There's a philosopher, Nick Walterstorff, who has makes a nice argument saying how he talked to this high school kid who had played a football game and he said, oh, we slaughtered them. To which I say, nice try, Nick.
Yeah.
But, granted, it was hyperbolic. And, you've studied the Assyriological stuff. They were all hyperbolic. Hmm. But to say that they were hyperbolic didn't mean they didn't kill people. They did what they could and claimed to have done more.
And by the way, Numbers 21 doesn't imply in any way that there were only combatants in these cities. Of course, the armies would fight with one another, but that doesn't mean that the non-combatants somehow cease to exist in their land.
The conquest narratives, I think a lot of people find very disturbing. So does God endorse what looks like ethnic cleansing, and why did God command the killing of entire nations, or what seems like he commanded the killing of entire nations, including women and children? There are multiple scriptures that seem to indicate this, and a lot of people have issues with it. So yeah, what do you say with that?
As I said before, as I look at these different texts, you can see that there is hyperbole or exaggeration in all of these kind of major war texts, the Amalekites or Sihon and Og and so forth, and even the battles in Joshua, where you have mention of, we left no survivor, we left alive nothing that breathes. And then you read in a chapter or two later that those people are still there and that they're being fought against again. And then you have mention of, for example, Judges chapter 1, where you get more of a realistic account, where you have kind of an idealized, we totally wiped them out using this rhetorical language of hyperbole. And then you read later on that the Israelites could not drive them out. They could not drive them out. And they are there to this day. So you have this kind of a tension between the realistic and the idealized.
No, Paul, this is not a question of realistic versus idealized. And those that work in the field on these complicated transmission history issues would cringe at hearing such a cheap harmonization. This is like saying, well, you can see in Exodus 21 that Israelites are able to be kept as slaves and then released without any provisions. But in Deuteronomy 15, they are to be released with ample provisions. This is because one is more realistic, while the other is idealized. This assumption of univocality, along with the application of theological presuppositions, leads to this type of uncritical harmonization.
For example, you see this in both in Deuteronomy 7 and Deuteronomy 9, where you have in one case, the Lord is saying, I'm going to drive them out quickly. And then but even back before that, God says, I'm going to drive them out slowly, little by little, because otherwise you'll be overwhelmed by wild animals and so forth, and so you're smaller in numbers and so on. So which is it? Is it being driven out quickly, or is it being driven out, little by little? And so you have that kind of attention throughout these war texts. We totally left alive. We totally destroyed them, left alive, nothing to breathe. And then next chapter 2, you see the survivors there. Deuteronomy 7 is an example of that, where it says, I'm going to drive. God is saying, I'm going to drive them out. And then, you're going to leave alive, nothing that breathes, have no mercy, etc. And then it goes on to say, and do not make alliances with them. Do not intermarry with their daughters. Well, if you've already annihilated them, what's the command for not to intermarry with them or to make alliances with them?
The idea that Deuteronomy 7 implies anything other than complete destruction of the 7 nations, because verse 5 proscribes intermarriage, is laughable. Let's take a look at another passage to see if this assertion has any merit. In Exodus 34, 11-16, God says that he is going to drive out their enemies, verse 11, but then immediately tells them not to make a covenant with these inhabitants of the land, verse 12. What inhabitants? I thought God was about to drive them out. Verses 15 and 16 read, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they have illicit sex with their gods, and they sacrifice to their gods, and they invite you to eat from their sacrifice, and you take some of their daughters for your sons, and their daughters have illicit sex with their gods, and you cause your sons to have illicit sex with their gods. This just doesn't make any sense, guys. Why would God give the command to drive them out if he was then going to command them not to intermarry and worship their gods? He must not have meant that he was going to drive them out. It must be hyperbole. God must have meant that he was just going to have a few Canaanites go on vacation to Egypt for a few months. I mean, give me a break, Paul.
Yeah, but Josh, he's not even getting the text right. Listen carefully, everyone, to how Paul recalls Deuteronomy 7.
First of all, God is saying, I'm going to drive them out. And then, you're going to leave alive, nothing that breathes, have no mercy, etc.
This is essentially correct. Verses 1-2 says, when Yahweh your God brings you to the land where you are about to enter in order to occupy, and he dislodges many nations from before you. And when Yahweh your God gives them over to you and you strike them dead, you shall make a herem offering of them. Do not cut a covenant with them. Do not show them mercy. But then listen to how Paul follows this up.
And do not make alliances with them. Do not intermarry with their daughters. Well, if you've already annihilated them.
Wait, what? The Israelites have already annihilated them? Is that what the text we just read says? No, this is Yahweh telling the Israelites what they are about to do, what he expects of them. He says, when Yahweh brings you to the land, when he dislodges many nations, when he gives them over to you, Israel is commanded in that moment to make a herem offering of them, meaning do not cut a covenant with them, do not show them mercy, do not intermarry with them. Man, wouldn't it be great if Paul could read?
In fact, you do see, again, if you understand that this is kind of idealized language rather than literal language, and again, this is hyperbole or exaggeration is quite common in the ancient Near East, which carries on over to today. People will use that sweeping black and white language, and it's used in absolute terms. But what's interesting, too, is you look at, say, the pharaohs as their accounting, as their war annals indicate, they say, that the pharaoh, Ramses or Tutmosis, they totally annihilated their enemies, that the pharaoh alone was left standing. He slew millions of them. Well, what we know historically is that actually didn't happen.
Yes. Just as we also know that Joshua's conquest, as told in the book of Joshua, actually did not happen. We know this because of destruction and settlement patterns in the Levant at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. As such, we know that Joshua is a programmatic fiction. But at this point, it becomes even more difficult to claim that the images in these fictional stories are intended to be hyperbolic. No, they were intended to reinforce the author's ideology about the land and to more clearly establish boundaries between insiders and outsiders. And writers succeeded in doing this by promoting violence. Yes, it's imagined violence, but it was the violence that was the point the writer wanted his readers to hear.
that they were not, they didn't obliterate their enemies, that in fact, sometimes their enemies even became a threat to them a generation or two later, because that wasn't true, what they were saying. So it is that ancient Near Eastern trash talk of, like we use in our sports. We totally, destroyed those guys, when in actual fact, it was much more exaggerated.
This is what I mean. This type of uncritical application of a literary device with which Paul he's really unacquainted. We have to ask the question, if something is actually hyperbolic, one, does the narrative continue to maintain coherence in light of the hyperbole? And two, what is actually being intended by said hyperbole? This is the fatal flaw, in my opinion, with seeing hyperbole in narratives like the Jericho account, with Achan in Joshua 6 and 7, and with the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15. The narrative simply becomes incoherent. If a text is thought to use hyperbole, as in the example of Sennacherib in the city of Herem cited earlier, we have to determine what is meant by the hyperbolic statement. Assuming that the statement is in fact hyperbolic, what actions would we assign historically to Sennacherib? Would we say that he simply waved at the city as he marched his troops by? Maybe he kicked some dirt into the first house he came to and then went on his merry way. Perhaps he killed 30% of the inhabitants. 50%? You see, when you simply invoke hyperbole, but don't follow it up with what you think did actually happen, it becomes a meaningless exercise. It simply allows the apologist and their loyal followers to say, oh, right, he didn't wipe out everyone. It's just hyperbole. Continue on, Paul. How many people do you think Moses or Joshua or Saul did kill? Or do you genuinely think this is just akin to trash talk in basketball? Come on, son.
Come on, son.
And one of the things that we need to note about what's different about the Old Testament scriptures is that they also include mention of those survivors, that those survivors are often living alongside the Israelites. And really what the issue is not Canaanites themselves, because there's, first of all, friendliness toward the Canaanites amongst the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And also, it wasn't an ethnic sort of a thing.
Oh my God. Did he just invoke the my one minority friend argument?
Sorry. Yeah, he did.
Abraham had Canaanite friends hundreds of years earlier, so this couldn't have been an ethnic cleansing. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of vomit in my mouth now.
Oh, God.
There's no, quote, ethnic cleansing. There's nothing ethnic about this. It's simply a matter of behavior, that these people are wicked and that they could have a pernicious influence on Israel. And Israel has a commission to bring blessing to the nations, the promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And if identifying with Canaanite lifestyle and idolatry and so forth, it gets into Israel's bloodstream, then this, runs the risk of jeopardizing Israel's identity and mission to the world, again, fulfilled in Jesus Christ, who would be the fulfillment of that promise that God made to Abraham. So you have this overall picture of God interacting with the Canaanites.
Here is the issue with this reasoning. According to the narrative, Israel does all this stuff anyway. They do worship other gods. They do fail to drive them all from the land. I mean, I don't know what it means for the Canaanite lifestyle and idolatry to get, quote, into Israel's bloodstream, but they certainly, quote unquote, commit fornication with other gods. They fail to obey Yahweh's commands, and therefore they're evicted from the land. Yet everything still works out. So even by his own lights, this doesn't seem to be a good argument. And this leads us to another significant point. Paul repeatedly brings up the drive out versus wipe out distinction as if this meaningfully changes the force of the moral argument. If they only drove them out of the land, and some even remained rather than annihilating them, then that's not nearly as bad, right? I mean, here's the issue. According to the lights of the biblical writers, not to mention our own lights today, being driven off the land is one of the most traumatic experiences described in the Hebrew Bible. Only a few examples of this will suffice. In the book of Lamentations, which is a lament over the city of Jerusalem and the destruction that befell Judah, it opens, "How the city dwells alone. It was full of people. Like a widow, it was great among the nations. A gentle woman among the provinces, she became forced labor. She bitterly weeps in the night, and her tears are upon her cheek. There is no one to console from all her lovers. All her friends have dealt faithlessly with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile under affliction, and under much forced labor she dwells among the nations. She has not found rest. All her pursuers overtook her in the midst of distress. The roads of Zion are in mourning, because no one is coming to the appointed feast. All her gates are desolate, her priests are groaning, her virgins are afflicted, and she is bitter. This picture of a desolate city is part of a genre known as city laments, where the deity has forsaken the city for whatever reason, and without divine protection, there is destruction and desolation. This is precisely what was predicted, according to the narrative, in passages like Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. In fact, in Daniel 9, Daniel recounts the sins of the people that brought about the horror of their exile. He said this, "To you, O Lord, belongs righteousness, but to us shame of face to this day. To the men of Judah and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and to all Israel who are near and who are far off, among all the lands where you have driven them, because of their unfaithfulness that they have committed against you." This was horrific judgment and caused tremendous pain, distress, and grief. They were driven off their land. Their holy site was destroyed. Does Paul think that the Babylonians were gently encouraging them into exile? The Psalms and prophets continuously speak to the horrors inflicted upon Judah by the Babylonians, for which Yahweh promises to repay them. In fact, there were still people in the land during the exile, and some were even able to escape to places like Egypt, not unlike some of the depictions concerning some of the inhabitants of Canaan, depending on where you read. But the point is this, it was still horrific and atrocious. Even if the only thing that happened to the Canaanites was that they were removed from their land, how would that be substantially more moral, Paul?
It's nothing ethnic here, but rather it's a matter of, are they going to be a pernicious influence on Israel or not?
Okay, he said pernicious influence on Israel twice. How many times has he given this exact speech?
He's been doing this for 20 years, Josh.
And if they're not, then they can live alongside the Israelites and so forth. There's no problem.
No, there is a problem. The problem is that Paul doesn't seem to understand that what he is describing pretty tightly fits the definition of ethnic cleansing. Here's what Professor Lemos has to say about what constitutes ethnic cleansing. Most major scholars of genocide, in fact, favor definitions that are broad. They favor inclusion of political and other collective entities and sexual minorities, as well as inclusion of behaviors that do not necessarily involve killing. Exemplifying the very broad definitions of genocide is that of Henry Huttenbach, who states that genocide is any act that puts the very existence of the group in jeopardy. What is necessary for actions to be considered genocidal in the eyes of most scholars of genocide is a desire to eliminate the group from existence, if not in total, in some very fundamental way. You see, the systematic effort on the part of the Canadian government over decades to forcibly assimilate Indigenous peoples through the residential school system was a form of genocide, not through mass killing, but through the eradication of identity and cultural erasure. What Paul is talking about is assimilation. It's no different. And this focus on suppressing or outright eliminating the Canaanite lifestyle absolutely is ethnic cleansing.
We see Rahab joining. We see, in chapter 8 of Joshua, we have Canaanite strangers who are there at the reading of the law when Joshua's reading it. So you have strangers and the Israelites alongside each other.
I'm not sure why he thinks this is a meaningful point. In Joshua 8:33-35, there are strangers or resident aliens, Hebrew care, that are present when the law is read. So, the presence of resident aliens is anticipated in the laws as early as Exodus 12. Why is this so significant to him?
Because he doesn't understand genocide in the same way he doesn't understand racism or sexism. I wonder if he would be offering this same apologetic for the Jim Crow South. We have black people who are there at the back of the bus along with the white people. So you have this overall picture of white people interacting with black people. Oh, this is gross.
It is gross.
It is gross.
We see Uriah the Hittite, one of David's mighty men. We see others, we see Hittites, we see Amalekites, we see Canaanites who are living alongside the Israelites and often cooperating with them. So again, we need to think of this not as something that is ethnically based. And God himself said that he would do to Israel what was done, to the Canaanites themselves.
So God is an equal opportunity monster. Got it. Thanks for clearing that up.
There's a book title in there somewhere. That's your next book, Paul.
It is, right.
So there's a lot of exaggeration. The word haram, quote, utterly destroy, it doesn't always, sometimes it just means exile. It doesn't mean, for example, in Jeremiah 25, 9 through 11, he says that he's going to, quote, utterly destroy Judah and leave their cities in everlasting desolation. Well, we know that Judah was not annihilated. They went into exile and then came back, and the cities were not everlastingly desolate, but for only 70 years. So again, this is an example of that kind of exaggeration.
Good grief. Look, this is what happens when you don't do the legwork in lexicography, but instead make assumptions about univocality and intended theological meaning in a text. The root chet resh mem appears in both nominal and verbal forms in the Hebrew Bible and can be divided into two broad categories. It can be used negatively, in usually the context of war, or it can be used positively, usually in cultic contexts. When used in the context of war, it can have four more nuanced meanings. First, it can refer to objects that are dedicated to Yahweh and to destruction. Second, it can be used, particularly in the prophets, to refer to a general type of destruction or defeat of a city or people. Third, it can specifically refer to total annihilation. Finally, it can refer to the status of someone or something that is being dedicated to Yahweh and to destruction. It is the second category, general destruction or defeat of a city or people, into which Jeremiah 25:9 falls. Examples like these do not contain specific language of totality and could simply be used to indicate a general defeat without reference to total annihilation. The salient point here is this, though. It is the context that determines how a word functions in each passage. Paul cannot simply find a verse that he thinks allows for this understanding of a word and then read that meaning back into the passage. That's just bad scholarship.
But I think what he's doing here is even worse than just that. Paul is reading his theology back into the appearance of haram, chet resh mem, in this specific text on the basis of his conviction that Jeremiah's prophecy came true, because all prophecies in the Bible have to be true. Like, this is absurd. So when Jeremiah says that Yahweh is bringing Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, to destroy Judah and the neighboring kingdoms, when Yahweh says that I will make a herem offering of them, I will make them a desolation, a hissing, a ruin for all time, then this word must mean exile, since that is what happened, according to the text. He doesn't bother to consider that Jeremiah might just have been wrong, or that there is a more specific theology at work here. Jeremiah goes on to say that this entire land shall be a desolate ruin. That's in verse 11. This is because in the mind of Jeremiah and later post-exilic writers and editors, it was necessary that the land was completely emptied so that it could observe a Sabbath rest in payment for the sins of the people. You know what? That never happened. There were always people living in the land, even during the exile, just as Josh pointed out. But that doesn't matter to the biblical writers. What matters is their theology about the significance of an empty land for the sake of God's judgment. Importantly, for our purposes, though, the word haram never means exile. It means to dedicate, to declare sacred, or forbid from secular usage, which then included the more nuanced meaning in war contexts of annihilation or total slaughter as a form of dedication to Yahweh. In every dictionary and every lexicon, you will never see exile provided as an optional gloss. In every English translation, you will never see this word translated as exile.
Yes, Israel, the Judahites were incapacitated, but they weren't obliterated. And so we see that sort of sometimes the number of commentators have said that the word haram, or quote utterly destroy, simply means that you have had a decisive victory. Flawless victory. And that's all that can be said about it, but it doesn't tell us anything about how many people were left surviving. In fact, it's typically understood as exaggerated. So it can mean decisive victory. Flawless victory. It can mean exile.
To be clear, the verb haram and its nominal form herem never means exile. It just doesn't. Consult every Hebrew lexicon or dictionary, and you will not find this gloss for the word. Paul has made up exile as an available translation based exclusively on his reading of Jeremiah 25:9 as a precisely accurate historical description of what happened to the people of Jerusalem in the wake of the Babylonian invasion of 586 BCE.
Yeah, I mean, let's just do it. Here, this is Halot, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. Dedication to the secularly unusable, to destruction or to cultic use only. Ban, what is banned, what is dedicated by a ban. BDB, Brown Driver and Briggs. Devoted thing, devotion, ban. The Theological Workbook of the Old Testament. Devoted thing, ban. Here's holiday, dedication to exclusion from profane use, to destruction, or to solely cultic use. Ban, what is banned? The New Dictionary of Classical Hebrew. Devoted object, that which is banned. Consecrated offering, ban, devotion. Gesenius, the devoting of anything to utter destruction. I don't see exile in there as an option.
I can't help but notice you didn't include Strong's glossary in there, Josh.
Damn it, I knew I missed one.
We're so funny.
Sometimes people are haram in Leviticus 27, but this is simply like a servant he's going to work for the priesthood, for the Levites, and he is haram, but he is set apart from ordinary use for work in the tabernacle. So they're not killed; they're simply set aside or set apart for this sort of work.
I just want to read these verses in Leviticus 27 out for the audience. However, the firstborn that are firstborn to Yahweh among the animals, no man shall sanctify, whether a bull or lamb, it is for Yahweh. But if it is among unclean animals, then he shall ransom according to your valuation, and he shall add 1/5 to it. But if it is not redeemed, then it shall be sold according to your valuation. However, every herem thing that a man dedicates to Yahweh from what he owns, from human to animal, or from the field of his landed property, shall neither be sold nor redeemed. Every herem thing shall be very holy to Yahweh. Every herem thing that he dedicates among humanity shall not be redeemed. It shall certainly be killed. Leviticus 27, 26 to 29. So, Paul, what does shall not be redeemed, it shall certainly be killed mean to you?
Duh. It means exiled.
And the same thing applies to fields or animals in Leviticus 27. They're not burned to death or destroyed, but they're simply set apart set aside from ordinary use to be of service to the priesthood and the Levites and so forth. And one helpful analogy, maybe this is, we can go on to the next question, but John Walton and his son wrote a book on the lost world of the Israelite conquest, and they talk about how the defeat of Nazism in World War II is something similar to what we're talking about here, that it is a matter of identity removal, and if you get rid of Nazism, it's okay that the German people are there. You don't have to get rid of the German people. Just get rid of the Nazism, the pernicious influence. And basically that's what we have, that the Allied forces got rid of the symbols and monuments and tried and executed the leaders. But basically what you had left behind were the German people.
How'd that work out, Paul? I mean, thank God we sure don't have to deal with the pernicious influence of Nazism anymore. I don't know. If anything, this analogy feels like it's doing a better job of actually showing how the propaganda I've been talking about works to distort reality in favor of ideological narratives.
We know that it's hyperbole because there's an exaggeration of something that's said, like, hey, wipe out every woman, child, wipe them all out. But then in the next few passages, we can clearly see that they're still there, that they didn't actually annihilate all of them.
Did they kill a lot of them? A few? Did they drive out most of them? Only some? Just the leadership? The biblical texts are not speaking of the leadership of the Canaanite nations when passages like Leviticus 18 and 20 speak of the land spewing the Israelites out, just as it spewed out the previous inhabitants of the land. The people are always in view in such passages. Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 are not simply directed at the leadership. The people themselves are the ones threatened with punishment. So his comparison of Nazi Germany to the conquest narratives is incredibly problematic, even according to his own lights. First, the continued presence of the Canaanites in the land in Joshua and Judges, it's not seen as a positive thing. I mean, take a look at Judges 1-3. Second, even if we were to grant all of Paul's assertions, the Canaanites were primarily driven out rather than killed, Paul would certainly agree that nearly all the inhabitants were in fact removed from the land. This is why only certain groups are said to have not been driven out. In this way alone, his analogy utterly fails. The U.S. didn't drive out the vast majority of the population from Germany only to have a few pockets remain. This is just cope after cope after cope.
You know, today people complain about God doing something about evil. Like, hey, there's a lot of evil in the world. And you'd write about this too. There's a lot of evil in the world. Why doesn't God do something? And here,
look, this isn't my area of expertise, but I can't just let this slide. Listen to how she framed that. Atheists and skeptics complain about how God doesn't do anything about the evil of the world. And then when he does something about it, they complain. No, bullshit. And you know that's bullshit. Skeptics aren't saying that God shouldn't have done something about evil actions by evil agents. Rather, they're saying that committing mass genocide or killing infants and children, as well as animals, are unjust actions. This is a straw man argument, plain and simple.
Oh, God, it's just so stupid. The point is that skeptics don't think God did anything at all, and they're not waiting for him to do anything now. Jeez. We can see that people throughout history have committed atrocities and justified them in the name of their gods.
we see that these nations were demonstrably evil, and God does something about them, and then people still complain about it, right? And so I think that's my next question is, who were the Canaanites? Who were these other nations? And why would God send in the Israelites to do something about their evil?
That God is actually doing something about it, that God is not allowing evil to linger or continue.
Wait, what? Look, you guys need to get your story straight. You can't say on the one hand, look how patient God was with these nations. He gave them hundreds of years to stop performing these heinous acts, while at the same time saying, God doesn't let evil linger or continue. Pick one.
God. Yeah, no, you just in apologetics, you just throw all the spaghetti at the wall. And I don't know. I mean, it's just, what if all of it sticks?
Throw it up against the wall and let the great spaghetti monster in the sky soar.
Yes, there we go.
And so the Canaanites were not much different from the Israelites in terms of, yes, you have, there is a kind of genetic overlap, as it were, and I guess DNA studies have been done.
Oh my God. Here's another example where Paul is trying to work in research that he knows is incredibly damning to his position, but in a way that lets him say that he dealt with it while not actually dealing with it. He spins it to fit his narrative. If you read Mary Ellen Buck's work on the Canaanites, the real Canaanites, not just the biblical depictions of them, she cites research that has been done showing genetic continuity. Quote, the team concluded that the same population has resided in the southern Levant beginning at least as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, and that the different cultural groups who inhabited the Levant during the Bronze Age, such as the Ammonites, Moabites, Israelites, and Phoenicians, each achieved their own cultural identities, but all shared a common genetic and ethnic root with Canaanites. You can kind of see how problematic such a conclusion might be for someone arguing that the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, who hailed from Ur of the Chaldeans in southern Mesopotamia, took over Canaan in an invasive conquest.
Now, where did the Canaanites end up going? Well, to Lebanon, basically. That's where the Canaanites, as it were driven out to. But when you looked at a Canaanite and an Israelite, you put them next to each other. There was no identifiable difference in terms of how they dressed, in terms of what they, the language that they spoke, and so forth. So it was really a minimal difference here, and the focus really is on lifestyle. The kind of practices that they engaged in and their idolatry.
Wrong. Paul is just unaware of archaeological data for this, or he doesn't understand it, or he's simply being dishonest about it. The fact is that there are no identity markers in the material culture from the early Iron Age, which clearly distinguish Israelites from other Canaanites on the basis of lifestyle and religious practice. The best he could do is point to differences in pottery or possibly very low levels of pork consumption among highland settlements, which are frequently identified as Israelite. But there are a variety of explanations for these data that are not as simple and naive as just accepting the late biblical explanations for these things. For example, is the shortage of distribution of pig bones a reflection of early Israelite purity regulations, or is it a feature of economic and demographic utility? If it is an identity marker, why would we assume it is religiously oriented? It could rather be more sociological, as a polemic by the highland settlers leveled against the Canaanite and Philistine city-states and urbanization. Pig domestication could have been viewed as a feature of city life, since pigs are a form of livestock that are easy to raise and keep inside cities. Look, the point I'm making is that we just don't know because we lack the data to explain the practice.
That could throw Israel off the rails and nix their mission to an identity, and of course their calling to bring blessing to the nations. So again, keep in mind, Ezekiel in Ezekiel, God reminds the Israelites that when he talks about Jerusalem, you come from Amorite and Hittite backgrounds. You're not anything ethnically special. You come from the nations, and of course, when you look at the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, you see that there's a Moabite connection. You see that there is you see that there's this kind of a tainted line, as it were, by immorality and so forth. But you also see Gentile influence as well when it comes to, say, Rahab and Ruth, who come from outside of Israel. So there's no, and again, the vision that the law has, for the nations is that the nations will be incorporated into the people of God, and we see this in Isaiah chapter 19, where Assyria, Egypt, and Israel are all called, my inheritance, my people, and so forth. That this is God's goal that they will be brought into the people of God, and this is a vision that God has from the very beginning when He's making this promise to Abraham that all the nations are to be blessed. So it's not as though there's some sort of inherent, curse on some ethnic group, and therefore this justifies some sort of ethnic cleansing. Not at all. In fact, some of those very nations that are being driven out are incorporated into the people of God, and as we read in the prophets and the Psalms.
What was Melissa's question again? Who were the Canaanites? Who were these other nations? And why would God send in the Israelites to do something about their evil? Oh, right. Let me see if I can sum up his answer. The Canaanites were similar to the Israelites. He mentions genetics in a very vague way among ethnic markers like clothing, language, etc. And Israel had a mission. And since the Canaanites worshipped other gods, the Israelites had to steer clear or it could mess up their own mission.
Also, Israel's bloodstream. You forgot to mention that this was all a threat of Israelite identity.
Ah, right. Sorry.
Gross.
And then finally, God had foreigners in the Messianic bloodline, and Gentiles were to receive blessing through Abraham. So it wasn't because of their ethnicity that they were destroyed or driven out or subjected to a rough game of football, whatever. This really didn't seem to answer her question in any meaningful way.
Also, we have the New Testament, which affirms certain things about Jesus. There's the use of just coercive force when Jesus, for example, is driving money changers out of the temple. But we also read that Jesus in Revelation, in red letters, in chapter 2, is saying that he says he's going to strike down or cast Jezebel on a bed of sickness and strike down or strike dead her followers. That's in red letters. Jesus is saying that. In Jude 5, our best manuscripts say Jesus, after he had delivered the Israelites, afterwards destroyed those who did not believe. Jesus is involved in this divine judgment that we attribute to the God of the Old Testament. Jesus is the one who is involved in that judgment himself. And I would say, too, that you see in Hebrews chapter 11, that, Acts 7, Stephen's speech, Paul in Acts 13, and also Hebrews 11 refer to the Canaanite wars without any sense of conflict about being peacemakers. So they're acknowledging that these wars were fought that the Lord drove out the Canaanites. And it says, we read in Hebrews 11 that the Israelites engaged in, some of these people, Rahab and so forth, that they engaged in acts of faith and courage, which involved battles, which involved victory over other kingdoms, and that they undertook this by faith. Greg Boyd says, yeah, it was a misguided faith. They were courageous, yeah, but it would have been considered demonic by the New Testament standards. Well, there's just no hint of that. That's just reading into the New Testament something that just is not there, and also ignores other texts that would say otherwise. So again, when you look at those Old Testament wars, when the New Testament refers to them, they don't see that there's any conflict between being a peacemaker, but also engaging in these wars.
Look, I don't have a lot to say about this sort of interfaith debate, but I will say that given what Paul just said, I don't know how it helps. If the New Testament writers are affirming the divine commands of violence and genocide in the Hebrew Bible, that just means that there is at least some consistency in the problematic portions of the biblical text. It doesn't seem to help to answer why God would command such atrocities in the Old Testament by pointing out that Jesus plans to do the same thing in the future. It also doesn't really solve the problem that Melissa brought up. How do they know that the writers didn't misunderstand or misuse divine messages when reporting on God's commands to genocide people groups? I mean, certainly by our lights, as I suspect Melissa is alluding to, it would seem that these acts often amounted to murder, something that is proscribed in the biblical texts. At best, this would mean that the New Testament sanctioned acts that we would consider to be murder. Not great.
Now, these wars were for a specific time. They were unique wars. This doesn't justify, going into another nation where they're acting immorally and so forth and saying we've got a right to do this sort of a thing, unless maybe there's a threat to another nation. But again, that's of a different order. It's unique and so forth. But and part of salvation history. So there is that kind of a unique qualifier that we should also add to that.
I don't think Melissa's question involved whether Christians today should conclude that they have the right, based on divine commands of violence and genocide in the Old Testament, to go and kill people groups today for acting immorally. Now, with that being said, I think that Paul would have a difficult time making a persuasive argument against leaders of America, let's say, who identify acts being done in other nations that are what the Hebrew Bible describes as evil or wicked, and wish to go in and stop them. This was the same problem debated in the antebellum South. It wasn't a question of to whom the commands in the Mosaic Law were given. Rather, it was the principle that God could not give a command that was immoral.
And with that, we will take a brief intermission.
Intermission, everybody!
A brief intermission in which to reflect.
In the interlude, I'm going to do a little beatboxing.
Sorry, did you finish?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh,
I was just doing some interim beatboxing there, so.
okay. Sorry, I thought
$20 as it finds its way somehow into the video. So.
Probably, yeah. Okay.
Intermission is now over.
So one thing to hit on the end of this question was, what would you say to somebody who says, hey, God commanded us not to murder, that murder is a sin.
Right.
So why is he commanding people to go murder, to go kill people? What would you say to that?
First, murder is different from killing. While all murder is killing, not all killing is murder. You do have instances of permitted capital punishment, for example, in the Old Testament. And you also have Jesus affirming the use of capital punishment in Matthew 15.
Is that actually what this text is about? Jesus in Matthew is affirming the use of capital punishment, as in saying, yeah, this is the correct way in which the state is to punish criminals. I always find that it's best to actually look at the text when assertions like this one are made. First of all, the text is Matthew 15, verses 1 to 9, and it is an abbreviated form of the story in Mark 7, verses 1 to 13, following it fairly closely. In Matthew 15, verses 1 to 2, some of Jesus' disciples are called out by the Pharisees for not adhering to the tradition of the elders. That's verse 2. These are thought to be their oral interpretations of the written law of Moses in the Torah, for they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. Jesus responds to this by turning their question back onto the Pharisees. And why, for the sake of your traditions, do you break the commandment of God? For God has said, honor father and mother, and whoever maligns father or mother shall surely die. That's verses 3 to 4. So here, Jesus is citing the fifth commandment from the 10 words in Exodus 20, verse 12, along with Exodus 21, 17. But then he accused the Pharisees of violating the spirit of these commands by providing a loophole in their own traditions. But you say, whoever tells father and mother, whatever support you may have had from me is a gift for the temple, then he is not obligated to honor his father. And so you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition. Isaiah prophesied rightly about you, saying, "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far off from me. They worship me vainly, teaching instructions, the commandments of men." Verses 5-9. So you see this, right? Jesus is accusing the Pharisees of hypocrisy by showing a place within their own traditions that violate the law of Moses to look after one's parents in their old age by holding back a cash gift for the temple ritual called the Korban in Hebrew. This teaching discharges the responsibility of care for one's parents. It's a double standard by the Pharisees to level a similar accusation on Jesus's followers. But is Jesus affirming capital punishment here? Not as far as I can see. His point has nothing to do with the merits of the specific law or the penalty of its violation, only that the Pharisees use their own traditions to skirt the existing law in places for their own benefit. But Paul offers more examples from which to make his case.
And also the book of Hebrews does affirm that punishments in the law that involved, something harsh or severe, capital punishment in Hebrews 2 and Hebrews chapter 10, it's saying that if you thought that these things were severe in the law of Moses under 2 or 3 witnesses, where somebody could be put to death, well, how much more severe will it be for those who reject the gospel or who apostatize, who turn away from what they know to be true?
Hebrews 10, verses 28-31 says, "Anyone who rejects the law of Moses without mercy on 2 or 3 witnesses dies. How much worse do you suppose the punishment will be for those who trample on the Son of God, violating the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and mocks the Spirit of grace? For we know the one who says, 'Revenge is mine, I shall repay,' and also, 'The Lord will judge his own people.' Terrible it is to fall into the hands of a living God." So, here again, Paul is citing this text as if the focus of it is to affirm or ratify the punishment prescribed in the Torah for rejecting any of its laws. Quite to the contrary, this is a rather emphatic threat of greater consequences for rejecting Christ than those once mandated for in the law. Again, the point being made is not in support of the death penalty. It's being offered as a comparative by this author to show the severity of the consequences for rejecting Christ. Apologists like Paul like to wag their fingers at others and insist that we need to make sharp distinctions between prescriptive and descriptive texts in the Bible when assessing its moral arguments. Well, this is exactly what's going on here. These passages are, by their lights, descriptions of how things work, not prescriptions for how they should. Look, I'm only drawing attention to this stuff to show just how duplicitous Paul is being in his recital of the biblical text, either through deliberate misdirection or sheer incompetence. He is not a good faith actor when it comes to presenting his own scriptures honestly and accurately. So he's going to go on and give ham-fisted assertions of war doctrine and Proverbs and retellings of stories of Paul's use of government security and Acts. Based on how clumsily he has stumbled his way through the Bible to this point, I don't think there's any reason to give him the benefit of the doubt for anything he has to say about these texts and what follows. You see, this is why both Josh and I set such a high value on looking closely at what the Bible actually says. We read it carefully. We focus directly on the texts that are most relevant to the discussion, and we try to be accurate. We respect you, our audience, far too much to think that we could ever get away with attempting to distract you or just outright lying to you.
And so the Roman government is doing what it ought to do. It is, as Paul says in Romans 13, that the government has authority to use the sword for just purposes. Again, it's not a metaphor for an officer's ticket book. The sword has a lethal connotation to it. And when the government is doing its job, when it's protecting the innocent, like Paul, when it's punishing the guilty, when it is preserving the peace, then it is doing what God has commissioned or ordained government to do. And so it ultimately, when it's doing its job, it will not be doing something that is unjust. So there is the permissibility of the government to use lethal force. I mean, we call 911 when there is a threat on our lives, and police may need to use lethal force if necessary. That's killing, but that's not murder. And so when God is commanding the Israelites to drive out the Canaanites, one, they're engaging in acts that would be considered criminal in any civilized society. God also waits a certain length of time, over half a millennium, before that actually takes place. Far different from Islam. We could go back to that question in a moment.
His responses seem so disconnected and rambling. It really isn't easy for me to follow. She asked him about why God would command murder. And he's gone on for more than 3 minutes saying, not all killing qualifies as murder. Well, gee, thanks, Paul. We know that. But this is the disingenuous nature of these apologetic arguments. When we say, quote, God sanctioned slavery, an apologist answer, yeah, but the word slave is used to describe Moses and Joshua or even the servant of the Lord in Isaiah. Yeah, we know all that. And that's not the point. If someone came forward and said, this man beat me and I need protection from him, he is still threatening to beat me and I am in fear for my life, it would be ludicrous for someone to say, yeah, but beat can mean he beat me in the game of Uno. So we need to interpret what he says through that lens. The point of this discussion, in case you missed it, Paul, is that the commands given in the Hebrew Bible sure seem to be instances of unjustified killing, that is, murder. That's why people are questioning them. And what's crazy here is that Paul uses the New Testament to justify these Old Testament commands by saying something harsh or severe capital punishment in Hebrews 2 and Hebrews chapter 10, it's saying that if you thought that these things were severe in the law of Moses under 2 or 3 witnesses, where somebody could be put to death. Well, how much more severe will it be for those who reject the gospel or who apostatize or who turn away from what they know to be true? I realize that people who have been raised in the Christian faith have become desensitized to this. But let's say this in different words, okay? Paul just appealed to Melissa and his audience by saying, look, Jesus is going to do horrific things to people that, 1, reject the gospel, and 2, leave the faith. Since we all agree that they deserve that for such horrific acts, why should God punishing people in the Old Testament give us any pause? Let me say this slowly. People deserve the raging fire that awaits them if they don't believe in Jesus or if they stop believing in him. This is why this shit is so dangerous. If not believing deserves eternal hellfire, how difficult would it be for someone to become convinced that it's okay or even necessary to kill people for not accepting the faith?
But again, to keep in mind, the main command was to drive them out. And if you have defanged the Canaanites of their toxic, pernicious, immoral influence,
and he is really into this word pernicious.
Maybe he thinks it also means exile.
And they can live amongst the Israelites without a problem. So just like think about Nazi Germany. You've denazified Germany, and then things could be restored to their proper order. But you don't have to obliterate them.
But they're not living there. That's the point. Even under a harmonized reading of the text, only a remnant of the inhabitants remain in the land, and they are specifically highlighted for this reason. Paul really needs to pick a lane and stick with it. Are they wicked and deserving of the punishment that God is meting out? Are they not killed, but rather driven out? Does nothing happen to them, and it's only the leadership that's replaced, and they're allowed to keep living in the land? I mean, come on, Paul.
Well, how does this differ? This warfare differ from Islam? To drive out is it just the same thing? Driving out the Canaanites? I mean, that's the major command. But Muhammad really ramps up the language here. For one thing, he says, Allah has commanded me in his farewell speech. Allah has commanded me to fight until all men say there is no God but Allah. So there is this sense of a religious coercion, military / religious coercion, and that that jihad meant not merely spiritual struggle, but in its original context was very strongly in favor of military battles. In fact, Muhammad engaged in over 60 military battles in his lifetime, raids and so forth, and was very, very ruthless with those even women in this process. And the command is universal or global, that it's not limited to a particular era. Say in Islam's life, this is a life. This is a history-long endeavor.
I know very little about Islam, but I've seen enough from Christian apologists who engage in counter-apologetics with Islam to never trust any of them to provide any sort of fair or accurate representations of the religion and culture. I expect that to be the case here. This is not to suggest that the treatment of outsiders in Islam is any better or worse than what is presented in the Bible. I just don't know And I don't think this silly sort of whataboutism matters. We're moving on.
Part of this is the God of the Bible revealing himself. So in other words, there are reasons to believe the Bible is true.
Truth is the degree to which a proposition corresponds to reality, as adjudicated by predictive power. A whole document is generally not uniformly true or false. Some sentences within a document will align more closely to reality than others. Now multiply that variability by a collection of books, be it the 39 of the Protestant Old Testament, 27 of the New Testament, or the 66 combined. Some sentences in the Bible align well to reality. Some very much do not, and most are a shade of gray. Declaring the Bible is true is like saying Wikipedia is true, or the phone book is true, or the Wall Street Journal is true. No, we take all those things one claim at a time.
Like really good reasons. I mean, you have prophecies that are fulfilled.
We have no Bible prophecies that are fulfilled in a way that is useful to serve as evidence for the Bible. I have 6 criteria that is too much to get into here, but a useful primer is my 75-minute analysis of Mike Winger's 8.5 hours of Bible prophecy claims.
So, just by way of a quick comparison, the writers and the collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls were also very convinced that their leader, the so-called teacher of righteousness, and their movement were fulfilled in prophecies of the Old Testament. Many of the same prophecies, in fact, as those championed by Christians for Jesus.
You have Jesus confirming the Old Testament.
While I'm certain that Jesus did believe the Old Testament, I'm uncertain of how this endorsement does anything to confirm its reliability. From an outsider perspective, this is like saying that the characters in Jurassic Park 2 believed the events of Jurassic Park 1, so that's somehow evidence that T-Rex is alive today.
You have actual evidence that people would have to grapple with and think, maybe this is true.
That's pretty much my whole channel.
And so if God is real and miracles can happen, and we look in scripture and we see these things, well, then I think it's from that perspective that we can come at this kind of question to help us make sense of the things that we're seeing. So if we can understand the attributes of God and who he is, it also would help us understand sometimes why we see what we do in the Old Testament in a manner in which we see it.
So the only way to understand the Bible is to believe that God is real, the Bible is true, and God can't do anything immoral? I mean, that sounds reasonable.
And another example is in 2 Kings. We mentioned this before with Elisha. The prophet was being teased by a group of boys, and so then he cursed them, and 2 bears came and mauled the boys to death.
Ah, finally. They're going to talk about the covenant bears.
The bears.
There is a lot of hyperbole and exaggeration, even when it comes to the laws that are given, not just in Israel, but in the ancient Near East in general. That, for example, the Code of Hammurabi talks about severe punishments if you're a builder and your building collapses, or if you're a surgeon and you botch the surgery, having your child killed or being put to death yourself.
There are negligence laws in many of the law collections in the ancient Near East, including the Hebrew Bible. In the laws of Hammurabi 229 to 31, if a builder negligently constructs a house and it collapses, killing the owner, lex talionis applies. If the owner is killed, the builder is killed. If a child of the owner, then the child of the builder. If a slave of the owner, the builder had to give the owner a slave of the same value. It's weird. It sounds an awful lot like the negligence law in Exodus 21, 28 to 32, where an owner is negligent in keeping his unruly ox penned up. If the ox scores a free person, the family of the victim has the right to the life of the owner. If the ox scores a slave, the owner has to pay 30 shekels of silver to the owner of the slave in order to replace it. Don't throw stones in a glass house, Paul.
For these, who is going to go into building or surgery as a profession if these are the literal punishments hanging over your head? And so a number of ancient Near Eastern scholars have said this was just simply understood to be part of the rhetoric of the ancient Near East.
It's a little more nuanced than that. These laws concerning lex talionis are thought to have put in place a system in which the victim could negotiate with the offender in order to receive fair compensation for the injury or death. If the builder negligently constructs a house and that leads to the death of the owner's son, then the owner has a right to the life of the builder's son. In this situation, the builder could say, essentially, look, I'll pay X amount of money to you for you not to kill my son. We see this in action, ironically, in the Hebrew Bible's goring ox law. The life of the owner is forfeit, but if the family agrees, the owner can pay to keep from being killed. This isn't rhetoric. The life of the individual was forfeit.
The law just allowed for him to pay his way out in order to provide fair compensation for the victims. Look, in my opinion, this is just sloppy.
Yeah, sloppy. Very sloppy. Also, but very disappointing. Not a word yet about covenant bearers.
Bears.
But this is to send a message, a clear signal to the people of God. And I think in early Israel, it's doing the same sort of thing. But people understood in the ancient Near East, outside of Israel, also within Israel, that these punishments were actually exaggerations.
What? No, you guys already talked about this. Come on. Oh my God. So we're really just going to dance around all this stuff and ignore the story of the covenant bearers?
And when it comes to, say, adultery, we see a lot of adultery in the Bible, in the Old Testament.
Oh, for Christ's sake. Do we have to do everything? Fine. It's up to me to tell the story of the covenant bearers. It's very short. In 2 Kings 2, verses 23 to 25, we're told that Elisha was going to the town of Bethel. And as he approached the city, a group of small boys came out to tease him about his male pattern baldness. Elisha felt bad, and in retaliation, he cursed the children in the name of Yahweh, and 2 bears appeared from out of the nearby forest and mauled over 40 of them, tearing them to pieces. That's what the text says. Now, I get why Paul is not especially eager to tell this story. If this is history, then it's horrifying. As terrible as it is that Yahweh would provide for the slaughter of dozens of people for the great travesty of making his prophet sad, it is even worse that these are children. Yes, apologists tried to sidestep the issue by insisting that these were not children, but adolescents, as if that somehow makes the story in any way redeemable. But no, the text is clear. These are small boys, unambiguously little children.
Yeah. It's so interesting how Paul argues about this in his book. He writes, first, these terms can and here do, sort of definitive there, isn't it, Paul? Refer to young adults, not simply elementary school-age children. That was page 114. In support of this claim, he cites 1 Kings 12:8, where the noun yeladim is used to refer to Rehoboam's young advisors. He also cites 1 Kings 20:13-15, where na'arim referred to men of fighting age. Neither of these carry any significant weight, however, as the phrase in question is na'arim katanim, which is young or little lads, not just yeladim or na'arim. He does appeal to 1 Samuel 16:11, where David is referred to as hakaton among Jesse's na'arim. But even here, he's arguing for the broad range of na'ar, not na'ar katon. In other words, Paul is arguing that the semantic range of na'ar and yeled, the 2 words for boy, can encompass older teenagers, and therefore that must be what these youths were. Now, let me throw a fly into the ointment here. First, the semantic range of a word allows only for the potential meaning of that word in a given context. In other words, if I say, my nose is running, the semantic range of running can include a person moving quickly with their feet, or an engine spinning, or liquid coming out of one's nose. If I were to argue that running in this case must mean moving quickly with one's feet, by citing places where running means to move quickly with one's feet, you would laugh at me for being silly. Just because it can mean something doesn't mean that it does. If we could argue this way, then it would be just as easy for me to cite Exodus 2:6, which has both Yeled and Na'ar.
Oh, yes. The famous story of when Moses was found in a basket in the Nile River by the daughter of the Pharaoh. You know this one. She opened it and saw that he was a young man crying. So she had pity on him and said, "This guy is from the Hebrew young man."
Yes. Well, here's what Kipp is translating. With his tongue firmly set in his cheek, by the way. And she opened the basket and saw the Yeled. And to her surprise, it was a Na'ar crying. Then she took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Yeleds of the Hebrews." Now, we know from verse 2 that Moses was only 3 months old at this time. Therefore, we could argue, because both Yeled and Na'ar here refer to a 3-month-old, that must mean that the boys in 2 Kings 2 must have been very, very, very young. But of course, this would be a fallacious argument. More importantly, however, is the adjective that accompanies Na'arim, Katanim, which means small or little or young. In 2 Kings 5, a Na'ara Ktana, a young girl, had been taken captive and was serving as a slave. She provides critical information to her mistress about the prophet Elisha, which leads to a solution to an illness that had befallen him. In verse 14, Naaman is healed, or Naaman is healed, from his skin disease, and the text reads, "And his flesh became like the flesh of a Na'ar Katon, and he was clean." Certainly the focus here is on skin of a youth.
Yeah, and probably not a teenager, because then he would have had bad acne.
Exactly. Perhaps more instructive, however, is Isaiah 11:6-8, where the text reads, "And the wolf will live with the lamb, and the leopard will crouch down with the kid, and the calf, and the young lion, and the fatling together, and a Na'ar Katon will lead them." Note the parallel ideas in the following verses. "And the cow and bear will eat together, and their young ones will crouch down, and the lion will eat straw like a cow, and a nursing child will play next to the hole of the cobra, and next to the den of a viper, the weaned child will stretch out his hand." In this passage, there is a poetic connection between the Na'ar Katon, the nursing, and the weaned child. I think it's going to take a lot more than just citing some places where Na'ar and Yeled can refer to young men to make Paul's case.
Now, as critical readers, we can recognize this text for what it is. It's a fiction, an absurd morality tale presenting a situation of gross exaggeration to make an unmistakable point about respect for authority.
We called him Baba Yaga, the boogeyman.
See, from this vantage point, we can look at the story and say, that's silly. One could even say it's fun. But Paul can't do this. For him, this story, like everything else in the Bible, has to be real. And because of that, he has to make excuses for the absurdities, which drive the rhetorical meaning of the narrative. It's a completely avoidable position to be in, where he's defending the indefensible while at the same time just completely missing the point.
But we don't actually see any kind of taking them to the city gates and stoning them and so forth. It's actually dealt with in more interpersonal ways. Or there's in the book of Proverbs, it talks about the shame of the adulterer will never be wiped away, and that there is a kind of things are to be resolved interpersonally. It isn't as though it just goes to court and things are resolved at the court. There are things dealt with between families, and there just is no presumption that we go and stone these people. So that's just one of the examples that I give, but again, that there is that understanding of hyperbole or exaggeration when it comes to these texts. So again, I shifted my view from an earlier presentation in the Moral Monster book. I mean, it's a slight adjustment, but I do talk about the commuting of anything outside of murder could be potentially commuted from capital punishment to monetary payment.
Okay, let's sift through the rest of this disjointed answer. She asked about the severity of the punishments in the Old Testament. The first example was death for breaking the Sabbath and the ground swallowing people, then Elisha and the two bears.
She brought up the covenant bearers, and he didn't even say anything about covenant bearers.
These are all divine punishments being meted out. Paul seemed to understand her question to focus on the first example, the Sabbath, and he goes off on a long explanation about how the laws in the Hebrew Bible represent maximum punishments and could result in monetary payments. I don't think that was the point of her question, and I honestly don't know how this helps his case. Seeing the disjunction between a law collection and what occurred in practice, that's a separate issue. The law collections and how they functioned historically is a complicated and a not yet settled question. I just don't think he addressed her main question.
Okay, yeah. So what would you say to a skeptic who says that, hey, the hyperbole argument is convenient? When do we know it's hyperbole and when it's literal?
Well, for one thing, I did take things more literally. In the first edition or the first book on Is God a Moral Monster, and then just in reading more, I realized, it does seem to be hyperbolic. So I went from the inconvenient side to the more convenient side from in the eyes of the skeptic, because I just saw that that's where the evidence pointed. So we ought to follow where the evidence leads rather than simply saying, that's a matter of convenience. Well, let's actually look at the texts. Let's look at the battle against the Amalekites, where we see a lot of hyperbole, where it says that Saul utterly destroyed the Amalekites, and then the Amalekites show up later on in the book, and David is fighting against them as well.
Now, I have engaged with Paul on this several times, but his argument never really shifts. Here's his argument as I see it. Premise 1, God commands Saul to kill all the Amalekites. Premise 2, the Amalekites are said to have been killed in 1 Samuel 15. Premise 3, the Amalekites reappear in the narrative at the end of 1 Samuel. Conclusion, the story in 1 Samuel 15 must contain hyperbole. God could not have meant to kill everyone. But here's the problem. There are other conclusions that also make sense of this data. Walter Dietrich, amongst others, has written on the editorial history of Samuel. See his 2015 commentary on 1 Samuel 13 to 26, pages 129 to 189. And it seems that the current form of 1 Samuel 15 appears quite late in the redaction history of the book. The chapter was edited into this canonical form to account for Saul's success against the Amalekites in chapter 14, while simultaneously contrasting Saul with David and showing Saul being rejected by Yahweh. To assume that the lack of perfect continuity between chapter 15 and David fighting the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 30 and 2 Samuel 1 allows Paul to reinterpret the meaning of the divine command in chapter 15, it's just methodologically unfounded. Let me see if I can give you an example. For all you Mystery Science Theater 3000 fans out there, one of my favorite episodes involves the movie Space Mutiny.
Buck, plank chest.
Stump, Junkman.
Dirk, hard peck. Rip, steak face.
Slate, slab rock.
Crud, bone meal.
There is a scene in which a member of the ship's crew is killed by the antagonist. About a minute later, that same crew member appears back on the bridge as if nothing had happened.
Hey, she's dead.
Wait a minute.
She died.
Wow.
Sir?
I think it's very nice of you to give that dead woman another chance.
This is almost certainly an example of a detail being missed in the film, leading to discontinuity in the overall narrative. However, at the end of the movie, the antagonist appears to die in a fiery crash. But then, as in many movies, the camera slowly pans over to what appears to be the dead antagonist, only to have him dramatically open his eyes, showing the audience that he is not actually dead. This is not narrative inconsistency, but a clear part of the story where the audience is supposed to think that he is dead, only to be surprised at the end to see him survive. In the same way, the inconsistency in Samuel concerning the Amalekites, it's clear upon close examination. In chapter 14, verses 47 and 48, we see, after Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side. Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and struck the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. However, in the very next chapter, we see Saul sent by the prophet to attack the Amalekites, utterly wiping them out. Finally, the Amalekites appear in 1 Samuel 30 and in 2 Samuel 1:1. Now, we could assume that this is more like the second scenario in Space Mutiny. The reader is supposed to think that God gave a command to Saul to wipe them all out, and this literary device made their appearance in chapter 30 surprising and significant in the narrative. This would allow us to revisit 1 Samuel 15, as we did with the death of the antagonist in Space Mutiny, and say, well, God must not have meant that. However, one would have to make an argument for why that might be. The other option, the one that scholars that work in the redaction history of Samuel hold to, is that the concern of the editor was a theological or ideological one, and that the inconsistency in the descriptions of the Amalekites is not intentional and was not likely a significant issue to the editor. But the more important issue is the internal coherence of the story itself. And this is where apologists simply miss the boat when it comes to the application of hyperbole.
Right? This is the same problem we saw with the story of the covenant bearers. Hyperbole just confuses the rhetorical point of the story.
The story of Saul's failure with the Amalekites becomes utterly incoherent if Yahweh meant anything other than totally annihilate them. If Yahweh had meant, hey, just soundly defeat them, then there would hardly be any doubt that Saul succeeded in that mission. Everyone, except the king and some choice animals, were killed. Saul should have turned to Yahweh and said, wait, what do you mean? Why would I have killed everyone? You just used hyperbole and meant for me to defeat them. Look, here's an analogy. Paul loves comparing these passages about genocide to sporting events. The Bills slaughtered the Vikings in the football game. Here's the problem. To make this analogous, we would have to do something like this. The coach told the players, let's go out there and annihilate the Vikings. Show them no mercy. I want you to slaughter them out there. When the Bills were making their way out to the field, the Vikings quarterback secretly approached the Bills quarterback and said, we have all seen how you have played this season. No other team can withstand your offense's onslaught. Please spare me in this game, and I will become a Bills supporter. The Bills quarterback agreed to spare him, and by the end of the game, the quarterback was not killed and was able to return home to his family, having been spared the slaughter in the game. The listener would think, the fuck? Why would they say that about the Vikings quarterback? Why would they have to specify that he was not killed? Of course he wasn't killed. This is just hyperbole. We all know that to slaughter and annihilate the other team just means to beat them. What about from the other perspective? When the Bills quarterback returned to the locker room, the coach pulled him aside and said, you are no longer fit to lead this team. I told you to annihilate the Vikings, but the quarterback made it out alive. The Bills quarterback would be like, the fuck? You didn't say anything about killing anyone. This is just sports hyperbolic language.
It's exile. He just mean to exile the quarterback, right?
Oh my God.
What about that? The battle against the two Amorite kings in Numbers 21, and then we read that that says man, woman, young and old in Deuteronomy 2 and 3. Well, which is it? Is it that there were no combatants in the battle in Numbers, or that there were? Well, again, if you understand that Deuteronomy is using a lot of hyperbolic rhetorical language, then you realize, oh, actually, this is that makes sense. In fact, I compare Deuteronomy's texts to previous texts in Exodus and Numbers were the same material. I'm going to send the hornet before them and so forth. Deuteronomy, in virtually every case, intensifies the rhetoric of what is kind of plain and simple. I'll drive them out and so forth. No, you must utterly destroy them. Leave alive nothing that breathes. So it's really a ramped up language in Deuteronomy compared to those earlier texts.
Let's examine this assertion about the material found in Numbers 21 and what is seen in Deuteronomy. Paul's argument here is that Numbers represents the more accurate or realistic version of the events, while Deuteronomy engages in hyperbolic language. Let's consider the account of the battles with Sihon and Og in Numbers 21 and compare it with what we see in Deuteronomy 2 and 3. In the narrative, the Israelites have begun to move north into the region south and ultimately east of Canaan. They first attempt to pass by the city of Arad without incident, but are attacked by Arad, and Yahweh gives them into their hand to utterly destroy them. Before we even get to the account of Sihon and Og, we see that the writer of Numbers is not at all hesitant to say that the Israelites put a city to the ban, utterly destroying them. In fact, verse 3 says that the place was renamed Hormah, which is built upon the root to utterly destroy. They ultimately arrive at the border of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who comes out against them. The account in Numbers reads, then Israel struck him with the edge of the sword and possessed his land from Arnon to Jabbok, as far as the sons of Ammon, for the border of the sons of Ammon was Jazer. Then Israel took all these cities, and Israel dwelled in all the cities of the Amorites, in Heshbon, and in all its daughter towns. In comparison, Deuteronomy 2:34-35 reads, and Yahweh our God gave him to us, and we struck him and his sons and all his people. Then we captured all his cities at that time, and we utterly destroyed every city, men, women, and children. We did not leave a survivor. Now, if we only went by this comparison, which is what I suspect he's doing, then we might be able to make an argument that the writer of Deuteronomy is adding hyperbolic specificity to the story. We killed everyone, men, women, and children. We didn't leave anyone alive.
Okay, sit on that for a second, because I don't think this works in his favor at all. Do you remember near the beginning of the video, when talking about this text, that Paul said this?
First of all, they drive out the people from the villages in Numbers 21, and then they fight. It says they fought against the king, his sons, and his army. So it's clearly combatant versus combatant, fighting. But Deuteronomy, which utilizes that sort of hyperbolic rhetorical language, says, man, woman, young and old.
Is that even what the text of Numbers says? That the Israelites fought combatant versus combatant? I'm just not even sure where Paul is seeing this detail, because it's not there in the text. In the lead up to verses 24-25, which Josh just read, it says this about Sihon. Sihon did not provide Israel passage in his territory. Then Sihon assembled all his people. And he went out to meet Israel in the wilderness. He came to Jahaz and he fought against Israel. That's verse 23. Where is Sihon's army? It says that he assembled all of his people, not his army, not just combatants. Look, there are words for these things in Hebrew, and none of them are here. Paul either cannot read the text or he's just lying to his audience about what the text says.
So how does this Numbers Deuteronomy contrast hold up as we continue reading? If we compare the accounts in Numbers 21, 34, and 35 and Deuteronomy 3, 2-3, we see that the embellishment or realistic versus unrealistic argument falls apart entirely. In Numbers 21:34, we read, "And Yahweh said to Moses, do not fear him, Og, for into your hand I have given him, and all his people and his land. And you will do to him just as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who was dwelling in Heshbon." Before we continue, notice that whatever Israel is getting ready to do to Og, it will be the same as was done to Sihon. When we compare this verse to its parallel in Deuteronomy 3:2, the line is word for word the same.
Word for word?
Yes, Kipp, word for word. Also, Hatikva.
Wow. I love you too, Josh.
So the line is exactly the same, except for the initial phrase. The Numbers version says, "Then Yahweh said to Moses," while Moses, retelling the story, says, "Now Yahweh said to me." Everything else is exactly the same to the letter. The Numbers account continues, "And they struck him and his sons and all his people until there was not left to him a survivor, and they possessed his land." Deuteronomy 3:3 reads, "Then Yahweh our God gave into our hand also Og, king of Bashan, and all his people, and we struck him until there was not left to him a survivor." The exact same phrase. And what can we derive from this comparison? First, if the text is to be believed, Moses and the Israelites did to Og just as they did to Sihon. Both Numbers and Deuteronomy say that they did the exact same thing to Og, which was to strike them, him, his sons, and his people, until there were no survivors. This phrase is in parallel with the crucial phrase, men, women, and children in Deuteronomy 2:35, strongly suggesting that this is precisely what the reader was to understand in Numbers 21, 23-24. And again, this kind of total annihilation should come as no surprise to the reader of Numbers 21, as the city of Arad was destroyed with just this kind of description, having been placed under the ban.
So you actually have evidence for this hyperbole, this exaggeration. And I'd say more and more commentators are just recognizing that dynamic, that they're saying, no, this is just referring to the word utterly destroy. Haram can mean exile. It simply just may mean decisive victory.
So to be clear, drive them out. That's the really real literal binding command. But leave nothing alive that breathes, that's just rhetorical flourish, not to be taken at face value. So what's the rule? How can we know which commands were literal and which were hyperbole? Because it sure seems like the rule is, if it makes a contradiction, it's a figure of speech. Checkmate, skeptics.
Right.
The other thing I wrote down when you were talking was there's a difference between the Bible describing something and prescribing.
Right.
Description and prescription. Yeah, hermeneutics, I think, could solve a lot of this problem where people can understand something being described. For example, I think it's in Judges, the concubine and the Levite.
Right.
It's really graphic. It's like something you would see in a horror movie.
Exactly.
And so you read through it a few times, and reading it now, I'm like, it's describing a horrendous thing. It's not saying, hey, God is okay with this.
Actually, it goes on after this account has taken place and her body parts are cut up and sent to all the tribes of Israel. The reaction is, this is horrible. How could this sort of a thing happen in Israel?
Yeah.
Those people ought to be, put to death for what they did. So there is a very strong reaction. So it's not as though it just goes unnoticed and then just is passed by.
This frustrates me for two reasons. First, there is the implicit conclusion that if the text isn't telling or commanding people to do something, then it's not a problem. A similar argument is made by apologists in passages like Ezekiel 16. This is a metaphor representing Israel's apostasy, turning their backs on Yahweh, worshiping other gods. It's not about actual sexual assault. This, however, does not in any way solve the ethical issues of this passage. Why use such a metaphor? Because it fucking works with the audience. The men and women hearing of the punishment for the adulterous wife would be thinking to themselves, well, It's what you get when you whore around on your husband. And Yahweh was so generous with his wife. She brought this upon herself. Just because the text isn't instructing someone to do something doesn't mean that it doesn't validate or justify that which is being described. Second, these aren't the passages that are under contention here. We aren't dealing with texts that describe actions that humans take that are understood to be evil in the narrative. Rather, we are citing passages that describe divine commands of violence and genocide and the sanctioning of owning other people as property. This sleight of hand trick works on far too many unsuspecting viewers, but your Jedi mind tricks won't work on us.
The Jedi mind trick doesn't work in real life, Dink.
Nice.
We read about Lot and his daughters in Genesis chapter 19, and they get him drunk, he sleeps with them, they become pregnant and so forth. And people like Richard Dawkins, the atheist, will say, oh, look at that terrible stuff, that incest. Well, that's just merely describing it. Everybody knows that that's problematic.
That's interesting, because earlier in the video, Copan suggested that God couldn't help but eliminate people who behave like Lot.
And what sorts of things were the Canaanites involved in? Well, incest.
Strange how Lot didn't have to be wiped out.
And also, there's some unique circumstances, too, that are unrepeatable. I talk about the Canaanite wars and, even the question about Abraham and sacrificing his son Isaac. And again, I go into detail on that in the Moral Monster book. But again, this is unique, but there are also facts that are very different from someone who said, oh, God told me to kill my son. Well, has God been into contact with you for 2.5 decades? Has God given you a miracle child, that came from both your bodies, and that through that child, the nations of the earth are going to be blessed? That God is telling him to sacrifice that son who's going to be the means of blessing to the rest of the world. And so that's why Abraham says that we will go and worship with Isaac to Mount Moriah, and we will return. He's planning on coming back with Isaac. Doesn't know how it's going to happen, but he's confident that God is going to keep his promise.
Sure, you can read this text through the lens of the later New Testament interpretation, like Hebrews 11:19. But that is something foreign to the text. But the bigger, arguably more obvious message of Genesis 22 is, no matter how difficult or bizarre a command of God might be, if you are faithful to him, you will perform it. In other words, faithfulness to the commands of God is what is most important. This message is one of the reasons that time and again believers will answer the question, would you kill your child if God commanded you to? With a resounding yes, absolutely. The danger with such an answer, in my opinion, is quite self-evident.
Yeah, and I don't know that the New Testament interpretation does much, if anything, to rehabilitate this view. In Hebrews 11:17-19, the writer tells this same story as a shining example of the power of faith. God, I feel dirty just, dealing with so much of this New Testament stuff. But anyways, by faith, Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was offering up his only son, of whom he had been told, it is through Isaac that descendants shall be named for you. He considered the fact that God is able even to raise someone from the dead, and, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. I think people are so accustomed to hearing these familiar stories that we don't often consider the way they're being told. Here, the writer of Hebrews says that Isaac was offered up by Abraham, that Abraham had deduced that God had the power to raise Isaac from death, and that he received Isaac back figuratively. What does this writer think happened to Isaac? It certainly sounds like he believes that Abraham went through with his sacrifice, not that he expected God to intervene and prevent the offering from happening. I guess that Paul is within his rights to point out that God was going to keep his promises to Abraham one way or another. But I wonder if he would be any less satisfied by the same outcome than this writer, who seems to envision that the quality of Abraham's faith was revealed in his follow through. He was offering up his only son as he believed that God was able to raise someone from the dead.
After all, God in Genesis 15 walked through the pieces of animals that basically were a picture of God as this fiery torch walking through the pieces, is basically saying, Abraham or Abram, if I renege on my covenant with you, may I be like this cut up animal. I mean, God is putting everything on the line to bring blessing to the nations through Abraham and his offspring.
Yeah, very poetic. He's a very poetic God. Yeah, and it also reminds me, you were talking about Ham or Lot and his wife in Sodom and Gomorrah. Right before then, I was very surprised to discover in actually reading the Bible that God has a conversation with Abraham, right? They're looking down at Sodom and Gomorrah, and even Abraham's disturbed. He's like, how could you, right? Like, how could you take out the whole city? And he's like, find me one righteous person, basically.
Right.
If there's 10 righteous people in this city, I will spare the whole city.
Yeah.
And if there's 40, and he keeps going down, he's like, if there's 50, if there's 40, if there's, this many. And so it's very interesting to kind of look at it in that perspective.
Yeah, the Lord is willing to show mercy, and again, He's always willing to relent from judgment.
I'm not sure this is the primary message of Genesis 18. Notice that Abraham does not appeal to Yahweh to spare the city based on his mercy. Rather, he appeals to God's sense of morality. Then Abraham approached and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous person with a wicked one? Perhaps there are 50 righteous people in the city. Will you sweep away and not take away the guilt of the place on account of the 50 righteous people that are in its midst? Far be it from you to act like this, to kill a righteous one with a wicked one, so that the righteous will be like the wicked. Far be it from you. Will the judge of all the earth not do justice?" In other words, there is a moral and ethical standard, not killing the righteous as collateral damage with the wicked, that Abraham is holding God to.
Why does God seem to tolerate or even approve of things like slavery and polygamy? You have written about slavery as well. And there's a whole argument to be made there, because when we think slavery, we think of, the African Americans being brought over here against their will. But in the Old Testament, that's actually kind of a different thing in their culture.
Right.
But yeah, slavery and polygamy. What do you got about this?
Yeah. Let me just first talk about slavery, probably the more pressing question than polygamy. And of course, let me just maybe mention polygamy is something that, is some evangelical scholars, most evangelical scholars would say that it is something that is not ideal, but is tolerated within Israel. It's
like
not seen as something like sexual immorality, like adultery or something like that, but it's not ideal. I would argue that it is actually prohibited in Leviticus 18:18, and I develop that in my Moral Monster book, and then extend that in my Vindictive Bully book. But I point out that this is that God is actually prohibiting the polygamy, marrying someone, an Israelite, and also a fellow, another Israelite sister, not biological, but actually someone who's part of the community of Israel.
This is a position that was held in antiquity as early as the scribes at Qumran.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah. The primary evidence for this understanding comes from the use of the phrase Isha el Achotah, which woodenly means a woman to her sister. In Exodus 26, this phrase is used to refer to two parts of the curtain in the tabernacle being brought together, one piece to another. Milgram explains that this led to the scribes at Qumran interpreting Leviticus 18:18 as, quote, a woman to another woman, which outlawed both polygamy and divorce. Some medieval interpreters read the phrase the same way, but concluded that the verse prohibited polygamy only if the husband deprives his wives of their conjugal rights. Milgram concludes, however, what most scholars have determined about this passage. Quote, the prohibition bans marriage to a sister-in-law during the lifetime of the wife. This, the plain meaning of the words, is reinforced by the context. The women are related to each other, as in verse 17. The prohibition is time-conditioned, as in verse 19. And achot in this chapter means only sister, see verses 12 to 13. He cites two other laws from the ancient Near Eastern law collections, Middle Assyrian Laws 831 and Hittite Laws 192, both of which allow for marrying a wife's sisters, but only after the wife has died. An interpretive hurdle for concluding that Leviticus 18:18 would be outlawing polygamy can be seen in Deuteronomy 21:15 to 17, which says, if a man has two wives, one is loved and one is hated, and both the loved and the hated bear him sons, and the firstborn son belongs to the hated one, then it shall be, when he wills his sons that which he will have, he is not able to make the son of the loved wife, his firstborn, ahead of the firstborn son of the hated wife. For the firstborn of the hated wife he shall acknowledge in order to give him a double portion from all that is found in his possession, because he is the beginning of his strength. To him belongs the judgment of the firstborn son. Why would the law give out elaborate regulations of inheritance concerning a man with two wives? Shouldn't the law just say, if a man has two wives, he shall be put to death?
So again, and I talk about where didn't God give to David Saul's wives and so forth. And then he goes on to say, I would have given you even more. Keep in mind, if you're permitting David to have all of Saul's wives, well, that would include his mother-in-law, which is prohibited in the book of Leviticus. So is God permitting this incestuous relationship? Of course not. Obviously, that's an act of adultery. Are we permitting adultery here for Absalom? After all, isn't God giving Absalom those women? Of course not. So I think we have to read it a bit more judiciously rather than kind of just saying, oh, look, God gave them to him. Well, there's a little bit more texture to the text than you might want to admit.
Okay. Let's take a second and analyze the narrative that Paul just massacred. See what I did there?
Nice.
In 2 Samuel 12, David is confronted by Nathan for having taken Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, slept with her, caused her to become pregnant, and had Uriah killed. The context is very clearly taking a woman from another man and having intercourse with her. Nathan uses a story to catch David off guard, telling him about a rich man in his kingdom that stole a poor man's beloved little lamb in order to feed a guest, rather than taking one of his many lambs. David demands to know who this man is, that he might be put to death, and Nathan replies, You are the man. Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I appointed you as king over Israel, and I rescued you from the power of Saul, and I gave you the house of your master and the wives of your master into your lap, and I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if too little, then I would have added to you things like these. Why did you despise the word of Yahweh to do the evil thing in his eyes? Uriah the Hittite you struck down with the sword, and his wife you took for yourself as a wife. And him you killed with the sword of the sons of Ammon. Now the sword will not turn aside from your house forever, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be a wife for yourself. Note the chiastic structure. You took as wife, you struck with the sword will not turn aside, you took as wife. Thus says Yahweh, I am about to raise up against you evil from your house, and I am about to take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he will lie with your wives before the eyes of this son. Because you yourself did it in secret, but I myself will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. This is fulfilled in chapter 16, verses 20 to 22. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, Give your advice, what should we do? So Ahithophel said to Absalom, Go into the concubines of your father, whom he left to watch over the house. Then all Israel will hear that you made yourself odious to your father, and the hands of all that are with you will be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into the concubines of his father before all Israel. Here is what Harry Hoffner says in his commentary on 2 Samuel, quote, The judgments of verses 10 to 11 correspond to David's sins. Because he put Uriah to the sword will never depart from his house, referring to the murders of Amnon, Absalom, and Adonijah in the following chapters. Because David took Uriah's wife, his own wives will be taken by another man, his son Absalom, which in turn will violate the laws of God, prohibiting incest. Knowing this and the specificity that the narrative uses when presenting these events, for Paul to try to make this general statements about generally everything of the previous king goes to the new king, and that David's concubines were not actually raped by Absalom, is just ludicrous and absolutely transparent coping apologetics.
Cope-harder. Yeah.
I just tied together Copan.
Oh my God. How do we miss that?
It's like that Brooklyn Nine-Nine episode where he's, I don't know if anybody watches that, but Madeline Wunsch is his nemesis, and he says,
Wunsch got served. Oh my God. Wunsch sounds like lunch. Oh, this opens up so many new avenues.
All right, sorry. Paul's like cutting all of that.
Yes, all of it.
Slavery, as you said, is not the kind of antebellum Southern slavery that we are so familiar with. Slavery in which it is basically the master could do what he wanted with his slave. There was no legal restriction to what could be done. Even if the master was not maybe legally permitted to do it, his foreman could do it. So basically, if you entrusted it to the foreman to kill someone, who was your black slave, then there was no legal problem.
In Paul's book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? He makes this statement concerning slavery in the American South. Now, some may claim that the laws in the antebellum South technically offered protection for slaves, even if those laws weren't carried out. They assume that the same could be true about servants in Israel. Laws prohibited abuses, but were not upheld in practice. By the way, in footnote 13, which follows this last sentence, he credits me for having brought this to his attention in 2019. I'm honored. Anyway, he goes on to correct me. This claim isn't accurate, however. It is true that overseers in a plantation could be punished for excessively harsh treatment of black slaves, but Southern laws, legislators, and judges ignored common law practice and its application to slaves, and they didn't hold slave owners and slave hirers to the same strict standard as the overseers. Ultimately, the two-tiered laws reinforced the slave owner's absolute despotism over the slave. Southern slave laws routinely accommodated the slave owners and were essentially a compact or arrangement that pertained only to the slave owner and his slave. Footnote 14 sends the reader to a lengthy article by Andrew Fide, Legitimized Violent State Abuse in the American South, 1619 to 1865, a case study of law and social change in 6 Southern states. Quite a mouthful. We obviously don't have time to cover the nuances of this 58-page article, but there are some salient points that need to be addressed in the way that Paul appears to be marshaling Fide's argument. First, the point of the article is to address the interpretations of other historians concerning the slave laws from this period, that is, Tushnet, Nash, etc. Fide's point is that while the laws, and even the reasons stated directly in the opinions of judges like Thomas Ruffin in State versus Man, may have paid lip service to the humanity of the slave, the formulations of the laws and the decisions made in interpreting those laws resulted in the practical absolute power of the master over the slave with respect to battery, and often causing the death of the slave. The dispute does not appear to be over the end result. Now, this isn't my field, but it seems that there is consensus that the result was the master being able to operate in real life with practical immunity, but over the humanitarian leanings on the part of the lawmakers. In neither case, however, is this relevant to my argument. The point here is that when comparing the verbiage of the laws in both the Hebrew Bible and much of the antebellum South, we can see, one, a nominal concern for the welfare of the slave being held in tension with the rights of the master to motivate their slave. In the Hebrew Bible, this is with respect to debt slaves, pledges, and perhaps distrainees. And two, laws that, when either not enforced or not followed according to the stated or implied spirit of the law, would result in horrific atrocities. Such is the case in both sets of laws. This is why much is often made of statements like Thomas Ruffin's in his opinion on the State versus Man case. Although he stated that the master should not be allowed to be cruel to his slave, the problem that he faced was how to enforce such restrictions. Here's a quote. That there may be particular instances of cruelty and deliberate barbarity, where, in conscience, the law might properly interfere, is most probable. The difficulty, he says, is to determine where a court may properly begin. His final determination, therefore, revealed, at least in what is written, the moral tension of this decision. He says this, such obedience is the consequence only of uncontrolled authority over the body. There is nothing else which can operate to produce the effect. The power of the master must be absolute to render the submission of the slave perfect. I most freely confess my sense of the harshness of this proposition. I feel it as deeply as any man can. And as a principle of moral right, every person in his retirement must repudiate it. But in the actual condition of things, he says, it must be so. There is no remedy. This discipline belongs to the state of slavery. They cannot be disunited without abrogating at once the rights of the master and absolving the slave from his subjection. It constitutes the curse of slavery to both the bond and free portions of the population, but it is inherent in the relation of master and slave. A decade later, in his opinion on a case involving a master murdering his own slave, Ruffin wrote, but the master's authority is not altogether unlimited. He must not kill. There is, at the least, this restriction upon his power. He must stop short of taking life. Let me be abundantly clear here. The reason that we draw attention to the laws concerning slavery in the Hebrew Bible and compare them to the laws in the American South is to show that even if the law prima facie limits the power of the master in matters of battery or murder, even if the law states implicitly or explicitly that it does so out of the concern for the humanity and care of the slave, the results can and have been atrocious. And just as we should not defend the slave laws in the American South by appealing to things like North Carolina's 1971 law, quote, which distinction of criminality between the murder of a free white person and one who is equally an human creature, but merely of a different complexion, is disgraceful to humanity and degrading in the highest degree to the laws and principles of a free, Christian, and enlightened country, be it enacted that if any person shall hereafter be guilty of willfully and maliciously killing a slave, such offender shall upon the first conviction thereof be adjudged guilty of murder, and shall suffer the same punishment as if he had killed a free man, any law, usage, or custom to the contrary notwithstanding. We should not defend laws that allow the master to own the wife and children of a debt slave as chattel, Exodus 21, 2-6, simply because the text says that the debt slave volunteers to remain as a chattel slave himself because, in part, quote,
I love my master.
You had the fugitive slave law. If a slave runs away, he has to be returned to his master because he's his property and so forth. Well, is that the view? Is that the vision that the Old Testament has? Well, a few things to keep in mind. One is that when it comes to Israelite, quote, slaves, the word slave itself is more of a neutral term. It can be used positively, can be used negatively, can be neutrally. But God says that he tells Moses to tell Pharaoh to let my people go so that they may serve me in the wilderness. So they're going to go to serve God in the wilderness. Well, that's a picture of liberation. That's a picture of freedom rather than oppression while they were slaves or servants of Pharaoh. So you can have a good kind of slavery or a bad kind of slavery or servitude. And Moses and Joshua are called the Eved Adonai, the servant of the Lord. And it's an honorific title. It's not as though servant is inherently evil or wicked.
This is just so old and played out. Remember our analogy earlier about someone saying that they were beaten? Just because beat can mean to win in a card game with someone or to mix ingredients together, both arguably good things, that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean to hit repeatedly in order to injure in this particular context. Come on, Paul, the argument isn't that Eved means chattel slave in every place that it is used. At least pretend to be engaging honestly.
It is something that presupposes that they have rights. For example, in Exodus 21, it talks about how if you gouge out an eye or knock out a tooth of an Israelite servant, then he gets to go free. You can't injure him. You can't just do what you want with him.
That's not what the text says. And Paul should know that by now. It says that if a slave, most scholars believe it refers to a dead slave, you can see Bruce Wells' most recent contribution to this, has his eye or a tooth damaged or knocked out, that he is to be released from his slavery. Contrary to popular belief, damage done to an eye or tooth was considered quite severe in the law collections. I have an entire appendix in Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery dedicated to this topic. This isn't saying that you can't injure them if what Paul means is that you can't hit or beat them, and it doesn't refer to just any injury. And no one is arguing that a master can do whatever they want with their slave. This has rarely been the case in history as far as the law is concerned. Even in the antebellum South, there were many laws that restricted what a master or their overseer could do to a slave. This is just setting up a straw man.
And it says that if a servant is struck so that he dies, the one who has killed him, it says he will be avenged. That's a word that we use for capital punishment. So some people, they want to quickly go on to, but if he survives a day or two and then dies, then there will be then vengeance will not be taken. Well, two things here. One is just stop after it says he will be avenged. That is a picture of capital punishment. It assumes that the Israelite servant has legal rights, that he has dignity, and that if that person is killed when he's struck, then there will be capital punishment.
Well, no, that's not actually a picture of capital punishment, because this infraction is in fact distinguished from capital crimes listed in verses 12 to 17. A man who kills another man is to be executed. We say that in verses 12 to 14. A man who abuses his parents is to be executed. Verse 15. A man who kidnaps another man is to be executed. Verse 16. A man who insults his parents is to be executed. In each one of these rulings, the punishment is described in precisely the same terms. Mot yumat is the Hebrew. He shall absolutely be killed. But what does it say in verse 20 about a man who kills his own slave when he beats them? He shall certainly be avenged. This is not the same language as what appears in the listing of capital crimes. What is more properly envisioned here is not a punishment undertaken by the ruling authorities. This is not an execution. It's more likely blood vengeance. since in this particular section of the law, these are Hebrew debt slaves or distrainees. Their unmerited killing is left in the hands of their families to make right. The text does not specify what that means. It probably means that the Israelite families of the man who was killed is within his rights to seek the death of his owner. But importantly, this is up to them to sort it out, which is fundamentally different from the inflexible rulings of the capital crimes mentioned above.
So just kind of stop there and don't just go running off and say, yeah, but what about this? Stop and recognize that there is a presumed dignity and worth, and that servant's life is not just to be taken at will. It is murder.
This is also the case in the laws of Hammurabi. If a man has a claim of grain or silver against a man, takes a distrainee, and the distrainee has died by their fates in the house of the distrainer, that case shall have no basis for a claim. If a distrainee died in the house of their distrainer by beating or maltreatment, the owner of the distrainee shall charge and convict his merchant. And if it was the son of the man that died, they shall kill his son. And if it was a male slave of the man, he shall pay 1/3 a mina of silver, and anything as much as he gave as the loan, he shall forfeit.
Well, what if he, gets up and walks around after a couple of days and then dies? Well, one, it's clear that it wasn't intentional. Secondly, he will not be avenged. That the quote master won't be put to death, but it doesn't mean that there's no penalty that comes along with that. Because keep in mind that if there's injury even to a servant, let alone taking his life, then there is a you get to go free if you're injured.
And this is where apologists go awry in this passage. The text makes two statements about injury: kill a debt slave, and it is determined to be intentional. Death, probably. Destroy, knock out an eye or tooth, set free. That's it. You can't expand this out to any injury or beating results in emancipation. That's just not what the text says. And it is certainly not in keeping with what we see in the other ancient Near Eastern law collections. You have to make arguments, Paul, not assertions.
So you can't just do what you want with someone. It says, but does it say that he's his property? Well, again, I unpack that, and you say you can take that in a couple of ways, but it doesn't mean that person is just basically, it just means literally his silver. Sometimes it could refer to the medical fees because it's in the context of accidental injury.
This idea comes from the late Harry Hoffner's article in the 2008 edited volume, Slavery and Slave Laws in Ancient Hatti and Israel. On page 151, Hoffner lays out three alternative views to the interpretation that the master can do whatever he wants to his slave because he is, quote, his money. The first is what Paul is referencing here. The second is that because, quote, he is his money, quote, it would be unlikely that he, the master, would destroy his own investment by intentionally killing him. Hoffner sees this option as less plausible than the first, but still possible. The third view is that the delay in the death of the slave in verse 21 was indicative of the master only correcting the slave with no malicious intent. Notice Hoffner's conclusion. He says this: all three of these alternatives represent ancient Jewish interpretations and fit the evidence of the text better than the view that the master was simply entitled to do with his slave as he pleased. While Hoffner thinks that the first is more likely than the second, he seems to agree that all three fit with the text. As an aside, Hoffner has a phenomenal set of recently published commentaries on Samuel. I read a little bit of one to you earlier. I would highly encourage Paul to read Hoffner's analysis of 1 Samuel 15.
But so you can say that is his silver if he's really shows goodwill and helps take care of his servant with medical injuries. Even if he dies, the judge takes that into account. But keep in mind that there is the context of that person has dignity and worth, that you can't simply treat him any way that you want to.
Again, no one is arguing that.
Also, I talk about, what about Leviticus 25? And again, in the Vindictive Bully book, I have 3 chapters on Leviticus 25, which talks about Gentile servants. Well, what about those Gentile servants? Well, one, those Gentiles, those aliens who are sojourning amongst you, it says you may acquire them, doesn't say you have to acquire them.
This is so stupid.
I cannot tell you how much of a disingenuous bullshit argument this is. Let me try to demonstrate that for everyone. If I were to turn to, say, Leviticus 29:10, which doesn't exist, and read, as for the murder that you may commit, you may kill your neighbor every second Thursday as long as you kill them quickly and without causing them to physically suffer greatly. What would Paul say? Would he say, well, it doesn't say you have to murder then? Come on, man.
Come on, son.
And how do you acquire them? Well, they could be runaway slaves. We read about, if a foreign runaway slave comes to Israel, he could be taken into a household and you're to give him refuge.
Well, no, it doesn't say that. Let's read it, shall we? You shall not hand over a slave to his master that has escaped to you from his master. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he chooses, in one of your gates, which is good to him. You must not oppress him. Definitely doesn't say anything about taking them into your house, nothing about giving him refuge in your house. Samuel Gringus says about this passage, quote, according to Deuteronomy 23:16-17, no effort should be made either to conceal the fugitive or to hold them. And there is likewise no duty to facilitate the owner's recovery of the runaway by bringing his whereabouts to the attention of the authorities. The law, therefore, tells Israelites to do nothing, neither to the slave nor to assist his master in recovering his fugitive slave.
Come on. Once again, Paul is like, he's not even being honest about the text. Need I remind everyone that he's talking about Leviticus 25 here? He asked the question about Leviticus 25.
Again, in the Vindictive Bully book, I have 3 chapters on Leviticus 25, which talks about Gentile servants. Well, what about those Gentile servants?
Of which he then poses the question.
And how do you acquire them? Well, they could be runaway slaves.
No. The answer to this question is right fucking there in Leviticus 25, verses 44 to 45. From the nations around you, you may buy male and female slaves. From the sons of the resident aliens who are settled among you, you may also buy from them and their families who are among you. When you look up this verb, kana, in any Hebrew lexicon, you're provided with a few options for translation. And by far, the most common one is to buy. In verse 30 above, it is the same word used for a house that has been purchased. It's the word used to describe when someone buys a field. It's used of buying wood and quarried stone in 2 Kings 12:13, clothing in Jeremiah 13:2, pottery in 19 verse 1, and livestock in 2 Samuel 12 verse 3. It is used often of buying slaves, as in Genesis 39:1, when Potiphar purchased Joseph, or when the preacher from the book of Ecclesiastes brags about his own slave holdings in Kohelet 2:7. In Nehemiah 5:8, the Jewish returnees from exile must purchase their fellow kinsmen who have been enslaved in other nations. It's the same word every time. Another, much less frequently occurring gloss is to acquire, which Paul is attempting to misapply to the usages here in Leviticus, where the word means acquire. The subject is often God, as in Exodus 15:16 and elsewhere of his people. See, for example, Isaiah 11:11 and Psalm 74 verse 2. Or in Psalm 78 verse 54, it's used of his holy mountain. But this usage of the word is most often in wisdom texts like Proverbs for qualities or virtues to be obtained. Acquire knowledge, Proverbs 18 verse 15. Acquire truth, 23 verse 23. Wisdom, 17 verse 16. Insight, 16 verse 16, and on and on. Look, the difference when it is to be translated as buy or acquire is obvious, and the latter absolutely does not apply here in Leviticus 25. Stop trying to make acquire a thing, Paul. No one is buying it.
But you don't just send him back to his master again. It goes against the fugitive slave laws of the antebellum South.
I think this is comparing apples and oranges. If the law in Deuteronomy 23 concerned slaves escaping out of other nations into Israel, this is not analogous to slaves escaping into free states in the same country. We see in 1 Kings 2:39-40, then at the end of 3 years, 2 of Shimei's slaves fled to Achish, son of Maacah, the king of Gat. And it was reported to Shimei, your slaves are in Gat. So Shimei got up and saddled his donkey and went to Gat, to Achish, to seek his slaves. And Shimei went and brought his slaves back from Gat. Note that the narrative says nothing negative about Shimei's actions here. In fact, they are completely anticipated in the narrative. The incident is simply used to move the plot forward, since Shimei was not allowed to leave the city of Jerusalem upon pain of death. In other words, the available evidence in the Hebrew Bible suggests that it was perfectly legal and expected for runaway slaves to be pursued and retaken by their masters.
Well, actually, you can have, some people will want to sell, as it were, or contract out their own children or own family members from among the Gentiles because they themselves don't have the means, and so Israelites can take them in, and there's really often no place to go, so they'll remain within a household into the next generation, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, no big deal, just generational slavery.
It's fine if you say it with a smile, Josh.
God.
But it also says that if that alien who is sojourning among you becomes a person of means, then he might be able to hire an Israelite servant to work for him.
Nope, doesn't say that. Come on, Paul. I thought you could read Hebrew. Now, if the resident foreigner living with you can afford it, and your brother living with him becomes poor so that he sells himself to the resident foreigner with you or to the offspring of the family of the stranger, after he sells himself, he will have a right of redemption. One of his brothers may redeem him. They aren't hiring him, they are purchasing them. These Israelites are debt slaves.
So it's possible as a servant in Israel to ascend to a great degree of economic autonomy and self-sufficiency and so forth.
No. Kipp, how many times do we have to go over this with him?
All the times, Josh. How many times did you have to make the same correction with Praise I Am? That you remember that guy? Apologists are unteachable. They do not listen.
Look, just because the same word is used in verses 45 and 47, that doesn't mean that it is the same person. When the text says that a toshav, a tenant farmer, or resident foreigner can become a chattel slave in verse 45, it is referring to the broad category of people that are tenant farmers in Israel. Let's say, to throw out a number, there were 1,000 toshavs living in Israel. Of this group, some could do well financially, and some could become poor, just like Israelites in this passage. In the latter situation, verse 45 allows Israelites to keep toshavs as permanent chattel slaves. However, if someone that is a toshav, not the same person as in verse 45, has good crop years and does well, and there is a poor Israelite living near them, and the Israelite ends up becoming a debt slave to the wealthy toshav, verses 47 and following show them how to handle that situation. Good grief. The text is not saying this. There is a toshav named Frank, and in verse 45, we see Frank, the toshav, being taken as a chattel slave. However, something happens to Frank, and he becomes independently wealthy, and in verse 47, Frank, the toshav, is able to purchase a poor Israelite. That's not what's happening here. I cannot believe we have to go over this again with him.
And the same words that are used for the Gentile, you may acquire them.
Buy, Paul. It's buy.
Are also the same words that are used for Israelite servants as well. That basically the same language applies to both.
Yeah, they are both purchased with money.
Both in the law and the prophets, it says that the goal ultimately is to have people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation, Gentiles, to enter into the life of the people of God through the promise to Abraham. And so the goal, and I was reading recently about, in Isaiah 57, don't let the foreigner say, I'm worthless, I'm just, kind of this dried up tree, I'm not part of the people of God. And no, God is saying no. The Gentile, the eunuch, these are all to be incorporated into the people of God, that this is the share that the Gentiles get to have as belonging to the people of God.
So now we are reinterpreting the plain language of the law through the lens of general statements about foreigners, not slaves, mind you, and how they are envisioned in the future as being incorporated into the nation of Israel. This is what it's come to.
So even if you're making a rigid distinction between the Gentile and the Israelite servant and saying, look, there's a distinctive difference between the two, and I show that that's not so, keep in mind that the law is provisional. There's some things that are permitted because of the hardness of human hearts, Matthew 19:8, and that there is a longer-term vision that incorporates Gentiles into the people of God. So this is only a temporary sort of thing.
That's an assertion, Paul, not an argument. Connect Matthew 19 to slavery. And even if you somehow find a way to do so, I haven't seen it yet, I'm not sure that's going to be the flex that you think it is. Remember, Jesus doesn't say in Matthew 19, do not divorce. He says, do not divorce, unless it's for this reason. So the parallel would seem to be, don't do slavery, unless it's for this reason. Probably not what you want to be saying.
Yeah, I know some Christian apologists who are trying to say that.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm.
This is not intended to be a permanent sort of thing because Gentiles are ultimately going to be included in the people of God. And so there is not that rigid Israelite, non-Israelite distinction. In fact, even in chapter 24 of Leviticus, the chapter before, the troubling text that people point to, it says that the Israelite and the non-native, the alien, are to be treated according to the same law, that they're to operate under the same law. And that in chapter 19, it says that you are to love the alien in your midst. The Gentiles, you're to look out for them. And that, the alien, the foreigner, and the alien, the widow, and the orphan, this triad is mentioned repeatedly in the law of Moses. Look out for the most vulnerable among you. Don't take advantage of them. And so this is not, Leviticus 25 isn't saying, oh yeah, take advantage of, abuse those Gentiles and so forth.
And the straw men just keep on coming. This feels like a record for you, Paul. No one is saying that the writers are intending the reader to understand the text to be saying, take advantage of and abuse those Gentiles. Now, we know from our modern view that Owning other people as property is taking advantage of and abusing someone. They did not view it that way. Thus, citing Leviticus 19 actually works against your argument. The writers did not believe that taking them as slaves was antithetical to Leviticus 19:33-34. You're mixing emic and etic categories again.
A final point that I'll make here is that there's a prohibition in Leviticus 19 against tattooing. Well, what's that for? Well, some people thought it was maybe related to idolatry and so forth. And what's the meaning behind that? Well, I think a good case can be made, and I've talked about it in some of my talks and in my Christianity Contested book, where a tattoo is actually a mark of belonging to another human being. That human being owns you, and that is why it is prohibited in the law of Moses, this mark of ownership of belonging to another person. You can't do that. You can't own another person. So there is this repudiation of the very evil. The essence of slavery in its evil form is that it treats another person as a commodity, as an object, and so forth. And even in the Old Testament, again a denunciation of the king of Tyre in chapter 27 of Ezekiel, and then Revelation 18 picks up on this. But it's a denunciation of the slave trade. It's a denunciation of treating human beings as cargo.
Wow, that's quite a leap. Okay, Leviticus 19:26-28 reads, "You shall not eat things along with their blood. You shall not practice divination. You shall not conjure up spirits. You shall not go around the side of your head. Neither shall you distort the edge of your beard. You shall not make an incision in your body for the dead. Neither shall you make a tattoo inscription on yourselves. I am Yahweh." Without going into any detail here, the first portion of verse 28, which is about making incisions in one's body, is something that is done for the dead and is also prohibited in Leviticus 21. The second portion of the verse, which concerns tattoo incisions, may have to do with slave markings, although it is difficult given the words in the phrase are hapax legomena. Milgram argues that this law would ban the marking of an Israelite as a chattel slave, as seen in Exodus 21:2-6 and Deuteronomy 15:12-18. He writes, "This fact alone should indicate that H, the Holiness Code, abolishes the statute of perpetual slavery, and as demonstrated by 25:39-43, H abolishes Israelite slavery entirely. Since H maintains perpetual slavery for a resident alien or foreigner, 25:44-46, it can be presumed that it also permitted such slaves to be tattooed." In other words, if Leviticus 19:28 refers to a slave marking, this fits well with the prohibition on treating fellow Israelites as slaves in 25:39-43, but says nothing about foreign chattel slavery, the slave trade, or treating people as cargo.
Yeah, I think this is one of many places that illustrates, too, the pretty sharp distinctions between different law codes in the Hebrew Bible. Generally speaking, scholars will often point out three primary collections of laws: the Covenant Code in Exodus chapter 21-23, verse 19, what Milgram has called the Holiness Code in Leviticus chapter 17-26, and the laws in Deuteronomy. Most would agree that the oldest of these is the collection in Exodus, and that the other two are using the Covenant Code as a base text upon which they are making amendments. They're updating the laws to meet changing circumstances, which means that many of the laws appearing in common between two or all three of these law codes will be different. Milgram has picked up on one of these when comparing the laws for enslavement of fellow Israelites in Exodus 21 to those in Deuteronomy 15 and Leviticus 25. So, in Exodus 21, verses 2-11, provision is made for Israelite men to be debt slaves for a term of no more than 6 years, after which they are released with nothing. Women are not released along with men and are to remain in permanent enslavement unless their owner fails in certain commitments. Now, Deuteronomy 15:12-18 is quite obviously amending this ruling. Like when you look at it, the wording is almost exactly the same. Women are now included along with men for release after 6 years. And owners are instructed to provide liberally for them upon the termination of their service, since Yahweh your God blesses you in everything that you do. That's verse 18. But then, by the time we get to the Holiness Code, Leviticus 25, verses 39-43 says that Israelites are not to be enslaved to one another, but they are to repay debts as hired labor. There is no fixed term of release, as in the Covenant Code and Deuteronomy, but now everyone and every plot of purchased land is to be restored to their family holdings after every 49th year, the year of Jubilees. So, When scholars look at the slave laws, along with all the laws in the Torah, it is always in conversation with one another and through this clear perspective of development. But this is just not something that Christian apologists do, at least those whom Josh and I come into contact with most regularly. What Paul is doing here, what he has done through this entire conversation with Melissa, to pick and choose legal statements that suit his own interest and assert these as representative of what the Bible teaches. He's doing this either deliberately or in ignorance of the complex intertextual relationships between various texts which were written, developed, collected, and corrected over a long period of time. This sort of ham-fisted exegesis is not only insulting to the often painstakingly tedious work of scholars, it's insulting to his audience. Because the Bible never says just one thing. It says a lot of things, often contradictory things that are not reconcilable in Paul's model of biblical inerrancy.
Yeah, I would say it's very anachronistic in a way to kind of look at what American slavery was and then compare it to when the Bible's talking about it, because it looked like it was definitely more sometimes like an employee-employer kind of agreement at some places too.
The key word here is sometimes, Paul. The texts of the Bible are not all saying the same thing, and you can't just ignore the parts that you do not like in favor of those you prefer. Sometimes slavery in the Bible does seem similar to certain employer-employee relationships. But then other times, slavery in the Bible looks very uncomfortably just like American slavery.
I was a little humbled. Like I had some issues still with the violence in the Old Testament, but I remember learning about slavery and I'm like, oh, this isn't what I thought it was. So that was actually really relieving to kind of look into that more.
Again, maybe the all-loving creator of the universe could have written his inerrant book in such a way that it doesn't require extra homework just to avoid violating our moral intuitions and more considered moral judgments. Or maybe I'm asking too much. And I looked into it until I felt better about it. Isn't necessarily the gold standard for research.
Guys, there's so much more to know. I would love for everybody to kind of leave comments, questions. I don't think that there's any question that Mr. Paul Copan hasn't gotten.
Well, we think we have 3 sets of questions for Mr. Copan that he hasn't gotten.
So first, you make a lot out of the distinction between driving out the Canaanites and killing every inhabitant. What is your ultimate point in making that distinction? Assume we were to grant that they were driven out and not completely killed. How would that help you? If the Israelites drove out the Canaanites at the edge of the sword, killing many but not all of the inhabitants, would that make the divine command moral?
Second, what was the hyperbole specifically in the narratives in Joshua 6, 7, and 1 Samuel 15? Did Joshua and the reader think Yahweh meant soundly defeat them, but obviously don't kill all of them? If so, why is Rahab such an outlier? Why would it be such a central part of the narrative that she and her family would only be spared if they hung the cord out the window? Why does the text focus on Rahab and her family as the only ones who escaped Jericho? Why does she tell the spies that all the people living in the land are terrified of the Israelites if they are in no actual danger? That's Joshua 2, verses 9 and 11. Was the command to commit all things in Jericho under the ban, chapter 7, verse 1, only hyperbolic? If so, why was Achan and his entire household killed? Finally, did Saul hear a similar command from Yahweh through Samuel? If so, why did he not respond in shock and dismay when he was reprimanded for not following through with totality?
Finally, were the wife and children in Exodus 21:4 chattel slaves? What about the slave in Exodus 21:32? Are the slaves described in Leviticus 25:44 through 46 chattel slaves? Were they owned as property and able to be kept permanently? If you say no, please support your argument, citing subject matter experts that hold that position if possible. Also, when answering these questions, it would be helpful for you to do so directly, dealing with the passages in question rather than spending your time sort of laying the groundwork, as it were, for how the reader should view said passages in light of the other, often clearly unrelated passages. If you don't answer them directly, please know that we will draw clear attention to that fact in our response.
All right. Well, that was a very long video, but I hope you found it helpful or entertaining.
Yeah, I think there's a productive level of this kind of stuff that we should be bothered by, if that makes sense.
Being bothered by it is the only reaction that makes sense.
I think a lot of Christians are afraid to kind of lean into this stuff. And I'm saying, no, if there's answers out there, let's look for them.
After 80 minutes of talking to Paul, Melissa is still looking for answers, not a ringing endorsement.
I mean, I could have sworn I said that at the start of the video, didn't I?
No one remembers. Thank you so much for watching. Check the description for links to books from Dr. Kipp and Dr. Josh, as well as for the New Insights to the Hebrew Bible virtual conference, where I hope I will see many of you. Thanks for watching, and until next time, later.